Okay, I think we're gonna get started. Um, Good morning, everyone, and everyone who's watching the live stream. We're starting a few minutes late. So next week is the second event of the year, James Baldwin. It's a 2-day event, Thursday, April 4th, and then Saturday, April 6th. So we're gonna spend today mainly preparing for that upcoming event, and then we'll also report back on Avant Garde issue number 2, because that will be published in coordination with the April 4th and April 6th event. And so I'll hand it to Alice to give some updates and just kind of discuss where we're at and prepare for next week.
Yeah, so we had our Year of Baldwin launch back in February, and I think the free school has had to mobilize very quickly for this April 4th event. April 4th, in memory of King's A Time to Break Silence, on April 4th, 1967, but also the second day of our event, April 6th. And I think the reason why I mentioned how we've had to really come together quickly in parallel to all the work that everyone is doing with the reading groups throughout the city, including Making Worlds, the high schools, the libraries, and then also with Avant Garde, is that probably what I'm feeling is also what everyone else is feeling, which is that people are stressed or tired, and then on top of free school, and we also have our own lives too, and our jobs and school, whatever it is. And actually, I think what I wanted to start this by setting the context also of free school is that when we think of King and the vision that we're trying to put forward, I think as I've been also trying to juggle that vision that we want to hold up, and also the personal that we all are going through as well. And when I say personal, I also mean, which is that, it's a vision when you pause and think, it's so worthy of of being our priority in our time. But at the same time, sometimes it can also be a lot of work, and you have positives, like you see something positive, but there's also pushback that you get as well from people, from the society that we live in. Every day it's not easy as well, too, moving about the world. And so actually, like in the past couple of weeks, I know we've all been focused on, just getting things done, because making sure that, we have the venue, we have food, we have the panelists, and making sure that everything is logistically as well all set so that the vision can come forward. Yeah. But I say that to say that, this past week I've also had to think, I think we all have had to think about, like, what is this vision? Like, why are we so busy, and why are we working so hard? And for me, I had to turn back to King, not just for clarifying what the purpose is, King and Baldwin, in the sense of like, why King and Baldwin? Why in the Year of Baldwin we're talking about King on April 4th, the connection between the two. And I know Emily has also been thinking a lot about that as well in the opening on the first day. But before I get into like the event and the vision, I also want to share, I've been reading King's autobiography and the difficulty that he faced whenever he took a stand, whenever he had to clarify what the task was, whether it was, and specifically for the war in Vietnam, knowing the pushback that he faced from his own people at times, and also mainstream media, politics, all of that. And so actually, I wanted to start by reading King to get us into the spirit of King, and also the legacy that we're picking up off of. Because I think in this time where there's so much war and violence and poverty and just urban decay is what King described it then as well, is in the face of that, what is that future that we're trying to, that we can pick up from the Third American Revolution, which is the Black freedom struggle, the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. Because the fortunate thing that we have in America is that we don't have to start from zero. Like there's actually there's a vision that's unfinished. There's a task that is left for us to pick up. And that's also the theme or the spirit of the event, which is what is this revolutionary legacy that's not often told, and also what is our task as a new generation to fulfill that task and that responsibility. So actually, these are all King's words, and there's a couple of sections where I think this is short, but this speaks to the pushback that he faced, and this is even prior to, well, this is prior to him being assassinated as well. He says, having to live under the threat of death every day, sometimes I feel discouraged. Having to take so much abuse and criticism, sometimes from my own people, sometimes I feel discouraged. Having to go to bed so often, frustrated with the chilly winds of adversity about to stagger me, sometimes I feel discouraged and feel my works in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. In Gilead, there is balm to make the wounded whole. If we will believe that, we will build a new Memphis. And this is when he's talking in Memphis. And bring about the day when every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill will be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. And then there's this other part where he talks about, and this is very aligned with also Baldwin's message, which is that to heal society, individuals also go through a transformation where they have to figure out what it is that they will stand for, and also all the obstacles that they face on the inside too. And so he says, now let me bring out another point. Whenever you set out to build a creative temple, whatever it may be, you must face the fact that there is a tension at the heart of the universe between good and evil. Hinduism refers to this as a struggle between illusion and reality. Platonic philosophy used to refer to it as a tension between body and soul. Zoroastrianism, a religion of old, used to refer to it as a tension between the God of light and the God of darkness. Traditional Judaism and Christianity referred to it as a tension between God and Satan. Whatever you call it, there is a struggle in the universe between good and evil. Now, not only is that struggle structured out somewhere in the external forces of the universe, it's structured in our own lives. Psychologists have tried to grapple with it in their own way. And so they say various things. Sigmund Freud used to say that this tension is a tension between what he called the id and the superego. Some of us feel that it's a tension between God and man. And in every one of us, there's a war going on. It's a civil war. I don't care who you are. I don't care where you live. There's a civil war going on in your life. And every time you set out to be good, there's something pulling on you, telling you to be evil. It's going on in your life. Every time you set out to love, something keeps pulling on you, trying to get you to hate. Every time you set out to be kind and say nice things about people, something is pulling on you to be jealous and envious and to spread evil gossip about them. There's a civil war going on. There's a schizophrenia, as a psychologist or the psychiatrist would call it, going on within all of us. And there are times that all of us know somehow that there is a Mr. Hyde and a Dr. Jekyll in us. And we end up having to cry out with Ovid, the Latin poet, I see and approve the better things of life, but the evil things I do. We end up having to agree with Plato that the human personality is like a charioteer with two headstrong horses wanting to go in different directions. Or sometimes we even have to end up crying out with St. Augustine As he said in his confessions, Lord, make me pure, but not yet. We end up crying out with the Apostle Paul, the good that I would, I do not, and the evil that I would not, that I do. Or we end up having to say with Goethe, that there's enough stuff in me to make both a gentleman and a rogue, end quote. There's a tension at the heart of human nature. And whenever we set out to dream our dreams and to build our temples, we must be honest enough to recognize it. In the final analysis, God does not judge us by the separate incidents or the separate mistakes that we make, but by the total bent of our lives. In the final analysis, God knows that his children are weak and they are frail. In the final analysis, what God requires is that your heart is right. And the question I want to raise with you, is your heart right? If your heart isn't right, fix it up today. Get God to fix it up. Get somebody to be able to say about you, quote, he may not have reached the highest height. He may not have realized all of his dreams, but he tried, end quote. Isn't that a wonderful thing for somebody to say about you? He tried to be a good man. He tried to be a just man. He tried to be an honest man. His heart was in the right place. And I can hear a voice saying, crying out through the eternities, I accept you. You are a recipient of my grace because it was in your heart. And it is so well that it was within thine heart. I don't know about you, but I can make a testimony. You don't need to go out saying that Martin Luther King is a saint. Oh, no. I want you to know this morning that I'm a sinner like all of God's children. But I want to be a good man, and I want to hear a voice saying to me one day, I take you in and I bless you because you tried. It is well that it was within thine heart. And I guess I say this too because a lot of what we're talking about the Year of Baldwin is that individual struggle to know and see good, but also to act on it. And something that King was able to speak to was people who knew what was right or don't always know what was wrong and right, and to what he says, dramatize the evils of society. But then for those who knew what was wrong and right to also act on it, because he's saying that people can believe that time can pass you by. And I think that's what we're also calling for April 4th, which is the urgency of the times, the urgency of war and peace for our times, the urgency of what King calls the soul of America. And I think that's what we're trying to instill in this event. And, through the event, we've been talking to, there's a theme of both April 4th will be held at the Unitarian and April 6th will be held at Zion. And those are both religious institutions. And we've spoken at Free School also about what the church has meant and how it's changed actually over the years, where young people are no longer joining churches. And there's a reason why, because it's not just the spiritual dimension that it has to appeal to, but also the lives, the material, what King calls the material lives of people that it also has to speak to, which is politics. And I think through this event, what we're also trying to do is to place a certain demand on churches of our times, which is for the Unitarians, the legacy of the Unitarians is being part of the Black freedom struggle. And there's the demand that they also have to strive and reach towards and may have forgotten. And I think it's the same with Zion too. Such a historic church and significant part of the freedom struggle. But I think right now there's also that gap that needs to be met. And we'll talk more about this as well with the overall framing of the performances. But that too, which is that for the performances on Saturday, where we have Cambodian dancers, traditional Cambodian dance, the Korean drummers, young men drumming, Alfie, Serafina singing. It can't just be something that's like, oh, how nice, how nice that we have these people coming together, performing, but actually framing, why is this so important, that art and culture, why is art and culture so important to part of a political movement and education of people? And It's also how when and I think that's what's important too for as we in the last week of the event to really spiritually prepare ourselves and understand like what is the task and the framing and what we also hope that people can strive towards in the event. The way when King gave a time to break silence, he was putting a task before the people of we can do better. There's a sky. There's a future that we have yet to achieve. I know I've gone on for some time, but actually, there's one last passage that I wanted to read, and it's I believe it's his last speech, Unfulfilled Dreams. And he's talking, and this is him even being prophetic too, where for those who struggle, they may not always see that future that we're building to, but they're the foundation of the stone in which that future vision can be built. And I think you were also saying, Tony, before preschool, which is that it's a long game as well. Yes, there's an immediate task right now, but it's also what is the education of people so that that future society can come to life. Actually, let me start here. So King, because I got really emotional this morning reading this passage. And King, this is in, I think, 1959 when he got stabbed by a woman at an event. And King when he was recuperating, he writes this. He says, well, about 4 days later, before I knew it, I'd been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to Harlem Hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon, and that blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you drown in your own blood. That's the end of you. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had merely sneezed, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around in the wheelchair in the hospital. They allowed me to read some of the mail that came in, and from all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I've forgotten what that letter said. But there was another letter that came from a little girl, a young girl who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at the letter, and I'll never forget it. Actually, can you read it?
It said simply,
Yep.
it said simply, Dear Dr. King, I'm a ninth grade student at the White Plains High School, she said. While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering, and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I'm simply writing to you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze.
Yeah.
I want to say that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960 when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961 when we decided to take a ride for freedom and ended segregation in interstate travel. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962, when Negroes in Albany, Georgia decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they're going somewhere because a man can't ride your back unless it's bent. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963, when the black people of Birmingham, Alabama, aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about the dream that I had had. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been down in Selma, Alabama to see the great movement there. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been in Memphis to see a community rally around those brothers and sisters who are suffering. I'm so happy I didn't sneeze.
Yeah, and then I think the reason why that one's important is that, I mean, we all know is that he was assassinated, and he didn't get to see essentially the decades after, and the groundwork that he laid for all of us. And that's also the legacy that we're picking up because it's not yet finished. And I know I laughed at it because there's also such a humor to King too, as well. And he's saying like actually why this young girl spoke to him too, which is he was always rooted in ordinary people and also the best of ordinary people. And towards the end of his life too, he didn't know, but he was grappling with these very personal issues too of like what was his life to me and what does death mean and what was the legacy he was to leave behind. And we had all there was I think 1 or 2 weeks when we were talking about Coretta and how Coretta was saying make this country worthy of king. And so truly the last passage that I want to read in are some, or I think this is his final word publicly too. And as part of his speech, a drum major instinct. So he says, every now and then, I guess we all think realistically about that day when we will be victimized with what is life's final common denominator. That's something we call death. We all think about it. And every now and then, I think about my own death. And I think about my own funeral. And I don't think of it in a morbid sense. Every now and then, I ask myself, quote, what is it that I would want said, end quote. And I leave the word to you this morning. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. And I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who are naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and to serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. But I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I wanted to say. If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody who's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian aunt, if I can bring salvation to a world once wrought, if I can spread the message as the master taught, then my living will not be in vain. Yeah. And I read all of this to say that, like, I want to share with everyone too, because I know we've been stressed. I know we've been anxious. I know there's a lot that that comes with an event preparation. But there's a higher reason that we're doing this for. And I know also we're not all religious too, but there's something about God or something unknown about the world or the universe that I think for each of us means like a greater calling and purpose. And I think that's what is important as we strive to. And no matter how the event turns out, April 4th and 6th, it's about what we spoke for and leave to.
Yeah. I also wanted to say a bit about how we're framing this event, because I think, yeah, like Alice said, I think we didn't have as much time as we thought. Well, I think this is where I'm a little bit like Mao, where like this is my Chinese side where I'm like, oh yeah, we can do anything. Like 4 weeks, yeah, easy. Like let's develop a whole framework of, yeah, let's climb the mountains. Like why not? But I think 4 weeks is not a lot of time to actually make a connection that I think is probably the most important connection for there to be a future for America, which is the connection between Martin Luther King Jr. and James Baldwin. And it's something that I think I kind of ignored for a long time. I was like, it makes sense, right? Instinctually in your gut, you're like, King, Baldwin, they're saying the same thing in a lot of ways, different language. But I think there's something important to make explicit. And for the first time, we're doing it in an event where I know people will be asking, okay, inauguration of the year of James Baldwin. People like James Baldwin, right? Like maybe people assume that he's edgy because he speaks with a certain anger, that a lot of people misinterpret King as not having anger because King is so like even keeled, the leader. Or people assume that James Baldwin is like unique in that he is gay or queer, whereas Martin Luther King Jr. is smeared as heterosexual, like old-fashioned man with a wife who cheated on her and that sort of thing. And what we're saying is actually, if you say you're down with James Baldwin, you need to actually know him. And you cannot know that he is a revolutionary unless you know that he and King's vision were exactly the same. And it's the vision for peace, but it's also the same vision of a new America that is related to America having to actually close the gap between what it says it was founded upon and what it lives by and what it actually does to its own people and to the world. And that's to say, because, we've been I think even before the year James Baldwin began, we talked a lot about how high the stakes are in this year, but also how much of a responsibility we have to like let people know that you may think you know James Baldwin, maybe you read him in English class, maybe you have read Giovanni's Room and you think that he is like a gay writer. He's not, he's a revolutionary. And within his words, what he's doing is he's trying to reveal to the American people something about themselves that it's so easy to deny every day. And you cannot understand James Baldwin, the real revolutionary, unless you also understand Martin Luther King Jr. as a revolutionary. And this event, what we're trying to say is, like, it's us both making that connection between James Baldwin and Martin Luther King. Like, let's actually dig deep. Let's get into the real vision and also their understanding of America that is necessary for people, all people at this time, to really become free or understand what a free country actually means, what a free person really is. And it's also to say that Martin Luther King Jr., it's for us to loudly proclaim Martin Luther King Jr. not just as a revolutionary, but as someone who has no equivalent in this country's history. And there's a reason why he has been buried. There's a reason why his legacy has been contained to just the I Have a Dream speech. And we were talking about this in our podcast meeting last night, but it's like, there's a reason why, for example, there's not an April 4th day, like a Beyond Vietnam, a Time to Break Silence Day. And when people celebrate King's birthday, people don't celebrate Beyond Vietnam. People will celebrate him saying, I have a dream. And people don't even really understand what he meant in that speech. And so this is for us to say, like, to actually give meaning to when we say King is the father of a new nation. Well, what is a new nation? And because a new nation is not actually guaranteed. A new nation is guaranteed when the people actually embark on the path to make it happen. And I feel like this is what we talked a lot about with the year of James Baldwin, but I think it's a task that we are willing to take seriously, not just through the lives we live, but to be able to say, like Alice was saying, like hopefully people come, like, you know, we do all this work to bring people to our events for a reason, to hear not just what we say, but to hear King and Baldwin, because that defines the very future of the American people, like our generation, the unborn generation. But it's also to say, like, even if no one does come, we still have that, just like King, like, it doesn't matter how many people turn their back on me, I will still have to speak. Like, I still have to speak. I have to speak. You have to speak. And we have to speak as if it's the last breath we have. Like, everything we say has to be the last breath, because we're not just defending King, but we're also defending for there to be any future, any revolutionary future for this country. And yeah, and I also wanted to say that, like, similar to what I was saying, where King is, there's no equivalent to King, there's also something very important for us, like on April 4th, because that's the main day that I'm the moderator of the panel on, I mean, April 4th, sorry, I think it's in May. I'm the moderator of the panel on April 4th, which focuses on Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And we're actually going, the purpose is not to talk about historical speech and just keep it to Vietnam. What we're saying is, like King says in the speech, if we do not act because there is such a thing as being too late, then the autopsy of America, because it will die, will say Vietnam. And it's the same indictment. Like, King always talks about America on trial, Americans on trial. Like, there is such thing as a final judgment day. There is such thing as an indictment of America. And will we let the autopsy of America not just say Gaza, but will we let the autopsy of America say, like, the Black children in Philly, people in this country who are poor? And like, that is kind of the spirit with which we're approaching April 4th, even when we're commemorating King's Beyond Vietnam speech, where he left us a framework. And by leaving us a framework, by giving us his life, he also left us a responsibility. And I'll get into it later, because I'm also trying to really think about James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo and Aaron Bushnell, and why it feels right. But I want to be able to articulate why it doesn't just feel right, but is right to dedicate this event to them. But like, it's King's Beyond Vietnam speech, where he basically poses the question of, what is Western civilization? And if America is to be a civilization, like, it will either be a civilization that dies because it insists it's a Western civilization, which is hypocritical and degrading from the inside because it doesn't live according to the values it says it does, like democracy, integrity. Like, Baldwin talks a lot about that. He's like, I don't even like to say artist, democracy, integrity, because it doesn't have meaning, because we haven't yet invented the word. It's a word, but we haven't invented the real word. Because we haven't really gotten to defining the real meaning. But King says, he's like, if there is to be a civilization, let us not be mistaken that a modern civilization means that you have like well-guided missiles and misguided men. Or like, we have scientific revolution, but we are, like Baldwin says, stuck in an emotional kindergarten. Because we don't even know how to do the basic thing of facing what is our identity based on, and the delusion of safety when none of us are safe, when actually there is such thing as any of us could be the junkie on the street, any of us could be homeless, any of us could be poor. The fact that there are children in Gaza dying, and every child that dies in Gaza should be a personal stain on yourself if you do not act or do not speak. And so, like, that's the spirit we have to take, because that's the spirit of the young people of even the civil rights movement. And so I'm saying all this because it's not just the framework of the event, but I think we're reaching a new stage in free school where every event, no matter who it's organized by, is really ours. It's all of ours. And we talked about this, how the year of James Baldwin is not just, it's for all of us to take up a responsibility and and to take up a certain task, because in a lot of ways what we're trying to do is we're trying to recover the revolutionary inheritance, which is to say the revolutionary inheritance of King, of Baldwin, their ideas, but also the lives they paid a price, like the lives they gave to us, they sacrificed for. I talk about it a lot where I say James Baldwin could have done the easy thing, which is to say that he could have just not written at all. James Baldwin could have just been a cool cat, and then maybe he could have just been stayed in Harlem and cool, whatever. But James Baldwin always says, he's I did the difficult thing, which is I wrote. And King says the same thing, which is to write is actually an act of agony, because it means you actually have to face yourself.
He said to speak.
Oh, to speak. Okay, to write for Baldwin, to speak for King is an act of agony. And for us too, even by being in free school, we're doing the difficult thing, which is also the only thing you can do if you want to live and not just die. And it's been interesting because I've been thinking a lot about why. I want to say I've only had time to really look at James Reeb, because I actually haven't heard much. I don't know much about Viola Leosa besides the basics of her life, but I find James Reeb to be so interesting because he was 38 years old when he was killed. And so 1 year younger than King. And I was rereading King's eulogy of James Reeb. He's a Unitarian, but he was born a Presbyterian. He's from the Midwest, I think Wyoming. And actually, honestly, the beginning of his life is very boring. It's very typical white family from the Midwest, with good parents, really loving. But yeah, his life was pretty boring, but there's something about James Reeb that I find both interesting, but in some ways, like King says, is the exact reflection of what any American can be, white or black, and must be. Because James Reeb, he actually says the reason why he goes from Presbyterianism to Unitarianism, and I know this sounds at least for me, because I wasn't born with religion, religion is very foreign to me. Sometimes all the semantics become, I'm does it really matter? Actually, it does matter. Presbyterian, Unitarianism, Methodist, it all matters in America, which I feel which is why I'm really interested in religion now. But James Reeb was raised Presbyterian, and he changed to Unitarianism because of Philadelphia. And the reason why is because he says it in his autobiography, which I skimmed this morning. He says that the reason why he got really stressed out, it became an existential crisis, is because a big tenet of Presbyterianism and is the idea of sin, and he did not like the idea of that an old word must be dragged into the future. And he's basically I don't feel James Reeb basically says, I don't feel the concept of sin and eternal damnation, that sin comes from an individual and eternal damnation. He was it doesn't sit right with me because I work at a hospital. He was a chaplain at a hospital as part of his residency in theological seminary. He was at Princeton as a Presbyterian, trying to be a Presbyterian minister. And he said, it was basically the color line. He said, how I thought to myself about how all my patients are Black. And how can it be that I'm being taught by Presbyterianism that they have sinned and I need to help them? I need to help them be redeemed, when actually I find them to be the most moral people I've met. And he talks about it. He's how can it be that these people who have undergone slavery are just so lovely, so kind, and they've gone through such deep shit. I think the drugs and homelessness. And he talks about how he met a 16-year-old young woman who was having her 6th child. And he says, how can it be that, how am I supposed to believe that they have sinned when in fact, I actually don't think, he said, if I put myself in their shoes, I don't know if I would have been as moral as them if I had undergone slavery, come from a people who've been enslaved. And then he says, I believe that the only original sin is actually society. And he says that. So then he leaves Presbyterianism and decides to join the Unitarian Church. Actually, it was after he met with the former minister at this very church, the first Unitarian Church, that he decided, I want to be a Unitarian. And actually he says that because he was I still believe that there's something about Christianity that gives all people a creative and vital source to change society. And that's why, and so and he even says he like prayed to God where he was like, why can't I just do the easy thing, which is like basically ride the gravy train of the Presbyterian Church? And like he was like, why do I always have to do the noble thing? Why can't I just shut the fuck up and be like, yeah, I'm gonna spend time with my wife and child John. I'm gonna like get paid this amount of money to be a Presbyterian minister. He's like, why can't I just like accept what all my mentors in the Presbyterian Church are telling me, which is they're saying like, hey man, we all agree that like the Bible doesn't fit perfectly, but like just try to apply as much as you can from Presbyterianism to like contemporary problems. And then James Reed reaches this conclusion and he's like, I just can't. And he says, it's just because I believe that there's something called truth. Like I want to be able to like live a life that I feel like where I'm actually applying my faith the right way. And I found that kind of deep. And he goes into Unitarianism, and then he ends up like really embracing Unitarianism. Actually, I wrote spark notes of the book to help with this. Yeah, but anyways, so back to he says it more eloquently, but he basically has an existential crisis about pursuing truth over comfort and being satisfied with the Presbyterian Church as it is and life as it is versus what he thinks it ought to be. And I found that deep because in some ways that's what makes someone like James Reeb both someone who I think everyone can become, because it is what Baldwin and King both call the price that you can pay, that everyone can pay. And that's to close the gap between even what you being satisfied with what is versus doing the like unsafe thing or the real thing, which is to live, which is to say that like to pursue what something ought to be. And then James Reeb talks about how he still believes in the enduring contribution of Christianity to mankind, that religion can be a vital creative factor in life for a person or group. And Philadelphia really impacted him because actually he ended up working at the West Philly YMCA. He lived at 50th Street and he there was a famous case in the 60s or maybe 50s where a bunch of teenagers killed a Korean student at Penn. And James Reeb insisted that the Unitarian Church take the side of the young people because the mayor of the city wanted to prosecute the Black teenagers who killed the Korean student. And the mayor was like, we should prosecute them and have them like possibly face a death sentence. And they were teenagers, like under 18. And James Reeb said, he was the one who said to execute these teenagers will only encourage the community to ignore that it has a share of responsibility for the death of this young Korean. And he basically said, he's like, I have a responsibility. We have a share of a responsibility, which is to say, why would you sentence these teenagers to death when really don't you see that it's the society that's on its way to death? And I find like Reeb to be like a really, because at first, I was reading about his like Midwest upbringing. I was like, yeah, like, okay, cool, like living, a little kiddo going to Grand Canyon with his family vacation. I was just like, it's kind of boring. But what's really deep is actually the choice. Like, it's that moral choice that James makes, and he even recognizes it, where he's like, why do I always have to do the noble? Why do I feel so compelled to do the noble thing? And he ends up going south because King puts out the call after Bloody Sunday in Selma in 1965, 66, 65, calling for all men of faith to come join them in this march, especially white ministers of faith. And that's when James Reeb, like the Unitarians back then were like, oh, King is calling on us, we have to go. And so they all chose their ministers from the different cities. And it also shows you something about how much the church has changed. Because in some ways, James Reeb saying Christianity has failed to really live up to the Judeo-Christian values that we like, in some ways that could be redemptive or could be helpful to American civilization. I feel like the church to this day, after King's assassination, has honestly really failed to live up to that. Too satisfied with the colony of time, not moved enough by that James Reeb spirit of like entering the eternal. And and then like King gives this, anyways, I'm getting to my point, which is that King gives this really beautiful eulogy to James Reeb at Brown Chapel in Montgomery, I think Montgomery. And the way that King is actually talking about what an individual life like James Reeb represents for all people is actually how, in some ways, when Alice was reading the drum major for justice, like it's honestly the way that you would talk about King, except more like and more intensely. And I say this to say that, like, I know that we're not like Martin Luther King in a lot of ways, but we strive to be like him, and we strive to live like him, and we strive to speak like him, and we strive to choose courage over cowardice like him. And I say this because I always get anxious before events, and I always have to read like a lot of like honestly, sometimes I feel like the work I do is more about spiritually centering myself and reaching a certain place rather than just like a mental place. And it's I feel like to reach a certain place that King reached or Reed reached, which is I have to speak in spite of everything I speak, in spite of everything I will live by these values because I do it for people who don't yet know I'm doing it for them. But I just wanted to read. I'll follow suit of Alice and also read a passage from King, um, where King says, where he first starts by saying he takes from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which you would think is like weird because that's supposed to be a love story. But it's actually not, which is also what Baldwin would say. But he's like, it's not really a gay story; it's about love, which isn't to say about romantic love, but to say something about society. And so, King starts in his eulogy, and if he should die, take his body and cut it into little stars. He will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night. These beautiful words from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet so eloquently describe the radiant life of James Reeb. He entered the stage of history just 38 years ago, and in the brief years that he was privileged to act on this mortal stage, he played his part exceedingly well. James Reeb was martyred in the Judeo-Christian faith that all men are brothers. His death was a result of a sensitive religious spirit. His crime was that he dared to live his faith. He placed himself alongside the disinherited Black brethren of this community. And I forgot to walk through it, but he was killed because when he was in the cell, through when James Reeb and two other white ministers were walking to their hotel after the march, these three white men from the town beat them, and one guy hit James Reeb in the head with a metal pipe, and James Reeb died from like basically the internal damage from his head. And actually, he asked his wife for permission to go before he went south. He was like, I feel like I need to go. Like, what do you think about that? And his wife was like, I really don't want you to go. Your place is here at home. And then he told her, like, no, I think my place is down south. And she said, okay, I respect your decision. Like, you should go. That's the right thing to do. And yeah, and then just like all the wives, like after his death, his widow Marie, had to speak for her now slain husband. Where people were like, well, don't you think he was asking for it by going south? Don't you think he was asking to be killed? And she was like, and she had to defend him and be like, no, he wasn't asking for anything except to be part of a struggle. And the position that those widows are put through. Anyways, back to King's eulogy. And then King says, who killed James Reeb? The answer is simple and rather limited when we think of the who. He was murdered by a few sick, demented, and misguided men who have the strange notion that you express dissent through murder. There is another haunting, poignant, desperate question we are forced to ask this afternoon that I asked a few days ago as we funeralized James Jackson. It is the question, what killed James Reeb? When we move from the who to the what, the blame is wide and the responsibility grows. James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. He was murdered by the irrelevancy of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a tail light rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician who has moved down the path of demagoguery, who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff and law enforcement agent who practices lawlessness in the name of the law. He was murdered by the timidity of the federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam, yet cannot protect the lives of its own citizens seeking constitutional rights. Yes, he was even murdered by the cowardice of every Negro who tacitly accepts the evil system of segregation, who stands on the sidelines in the midst of a mighty struggle for justice. So in his death, James Reeb says something to each of us, black and white alike, says that we must substitute courage for caution, says to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murder. His death says to us that we must work passionately, unrelentingly, to make the American dream a reality. So he did not die in vain. And then he says, one day, the history of this great period of social change will be written in all of its completeness. On that bright day, our nation will recognize its real heroes. They will be thousands of dedicated men and women with a noble sense of purpose that enables them to face fury and hostile mobs with the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of the pioneers. They will be faceless, anonymous, relentless young people, black and white, who have temporarily left behind the towers of learning to storm the barricades of violence. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in the 72-year-old Negro woman in Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity, and with the people who decided not to ride the segregated buses, who responded with ungrammatical profundity to one who inquired about her weariness, my feet is tired, but my soul is rested. They will be ministers of the gospel, priests, rabbis, and nuns who are willing to march for freedom, to go to jail for conscience' sake. One day the South will know from these dedicated children of God, courageously protesting segregation, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream, standing up with the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby carrying our whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. When this glorious story is written, the name of James Reeb will stand as a shining example of manhood at its best. So I can say to you this afternoon, my friends, that in spite of the tensions and uncertainties of this period, something profoundly meaningful is taking place. Old systems of exploitation and oppression are passing away. Out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. Doors of opportunity are gradually being opened. Those at the bottom of society, shirtless and barefoot people of the land, are developing a new sense of somebodyness, carving a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of despair. People who stand in darkness have seen a great light. Here and there, an individual or group dares to love and rises to the majestic height of moral maturity. Therefore, I am not yet discouraged about the future. Granted, the easygoing optimism of yesteryear is impossible. Granted that those who pioneered in the struggle for peace and freedom will still face uncomfortable jail terms and painful threats of death. They will still be battered by the storms of persecution, leading them to the nagging feeling that they can no longer bear such a heavy burden. The temptation of wanting to retreat to a more quiet and serene life. Granted that we face a world crisis which leaves us standing so often amid the surging murmur of life's restless seas. But every crisis has both its dangers and its opportunities, its valleys of salvation or doom in a dark, confused world. The kingdom of God may yet reign in the hearts of men. And then the last part, and this is the part where he's talking about James Reeb, but I actually think it's the same spirit with which we owe Martin Luther King Jr. something, as the young people who, like King describes, will be one day remembered as the faceless, anonymous young people who, against all the headwinds, were ready to slam against the barricades of a violent society. Where he says, I say in conclusion, the greatest tribute that we can pay to James Reeb this afternoon is to continue the work he so nobly started, but could not finish, because his life, like the Schubert unfinished symphony, was cut off at an early age. We have the challenge and charge to continue. We must work right here in Alabama and all over the United States, till men everywhere will respect the dignity and worth of human personalities. We must work with all our hearts to establish a society where men will be, that out of one blood God made all men to dwell upon the face of the earth. And he says, so we thank God for the life of James Reeb. We thank God for his goodness. We thank God that he was willing to lay down his life in order to redeem the soul of our nation. So I say, so Horatio said as he stood over the dead body of Hamlet, good night, sweet prince. May the flight of angels take thee to thy eternal rest. And I forget where else he said it, but he says it again. And I think it sounds dramatic, but it's actually not. It's dramatic in its simplicity and its ordinary tragedy of human, like basically the price we all pay, which is, he says, thank God for James Reeb, who was willing to lay down his life to give America the possibility of redemption. And he says, may his life have not been lost in vain. Like, he's basically saying that it's not meant to be a negative thing, but it's to say we owe every life lost something, which is to continue, which is to fight for the future. And I feel very passionately that we owe, and this is something Nathan and I have talked about for the roundtable he's moderating on April 6th about a generation prepared to pay dues to the future. But it's like, I feel passionately that we were all born to, in some ways, make sure King's life was not given in vain. And it's not just about King, but it's about a redemption for a country. And the way Baldwin and King come back together is Baldwin makes it a point to say, King is giving everything he has, even against his own personal discomforts of being a leader, something he doesn't feel prepared for, in order to arise to a point of what he calls beloved community, but what I would call a new nationhood. And I think that's the spirit of Thursday and Saturday. And I think we all, like, whether we're speaking or not, like, I think that's all an important, we're on this journey together. And it's not, this event is not going to be the last time we have an event. It's not the last time we have a reading group. And like this year, I think Alice has talked a lot about a bit as a test. And it's more of like, yeah, I think it's a defining moment for us, not just as free school, as like a collective, but as us as human beings and Americans and young people, to be part of like a very precious experience, which is to be at the vanguard of a movement of people who are unsatisfied with allowing their country to commit genocide in Gaza, despite how much Biden wants to insist that we sign a UN resolution that says like we support ceasefire or whatever. And so that was my testimony this morning. And I guess the last thing I would say is King, like, yeah, it's been really interesting rediscovering King. Like, I feel like you rediscover him over and over and over again, and you wonder how this person was like a real person. But it's kind of deep that King, he says somewhere, he says, I didn't learn revolution from Marx, although Marx was a revolutionary. He says, I learned revolution from Jesus. And he was like, Christianity and all the churches have forgotten that we've always had the revolutionary edge, and it's Jesus Christ. And, of course, it's, I don't know what today is called. Is it something Saturday? I know yesterday was Good Friday, but I think it's deep.
Yesterday was Good Friday. Today is Holy Saturday.
Holy Saturday. That, yeah, Jesus, like, yeah, King, it's in ways it's that chronology where King says, like, I learned how to be a revolutionary. Like, I've read Das Kapital and I thought it was great, but I learned to be a revolutionary from Jesus Christ. And he said, he was like, young men and women who've lost faith in the church must see that Jesus was a serious man precisely because he dealt with the tang of the human amid the glow of the divine, that he was concerned about their problems. He was concerned about bread. He opened and started Operation Breadbasket a long time ago. He initiated the first sit-in movement, the greatest revolutionary that history has ever known. And when people tell us when we stand up that we got our inspiration from this or that, go back and let them know where we got our inspiration. I read Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto years ago when I was a student in college. And many of the revolutionary movements in the world came into being as a result of what Marx talked about. The great tragedy is that Christianity failed to see that it had the revolutionary edge. You don't have to go to Karl Marx to learn how to be a revolutionary. I didn't get my inspiration from Karl Marx. I got it from a man named Jesus, a Galilean saint who said he was anointed to heal the brokenhearted. He was anointed to deal with the problems of the poor. And that is where we get our inspiration. When we go out in a day when we have a message for the world, and we can change this world, and we can change this nation. So yeah, anyways, and that goes back to why I love Jesus. No, it's true, yeah. And yeah, it also says, like, it's what we were talking about, like history. You know, April 4th to 6th, Nathan and I talked a lot about, because we're both moderating the main like panels and stuff, we talked a lot about how history and like, you know, people always, I know at this point I talk a lot, I talk for like 20 minutes, but you know, people talk about history as something in textbooks. And like we feel really deep that history, like young people, history is something young people deserve to know. And they deserve to know King, and they deserve to know that we have had a revolutionary edge this whole time. And that's a beautiful thing. And that is the only optimism you need, like the only breadcrumb of optimism you need to move forward and to feel nourished to go forward. And yeah, and like we, you know, like Karl Marx is a beautiful man, but you should know that you don't need Karl Marx to know that you already can be a revolutionary to like carve out the future. And that's because like we had King, and King is just like Jesus Christ. And like King himself says, like there's like I know of the greatest revolutionary history has ever seen, and that's Jesus. So anyways, yeah, that's all to say that I'm looking forward to the event next week, and I think we have an important task. And you know, technically we only have 5 days left. Yeah, we're doing, like, I think it'll be really good. And like in some ways we're trying to do right to our ancestors, Diane Nash, Baldwin, and King, but we're also going to talk about like how we see the future of American civilization. And it's not so-called modernity, but in fact with the concert, we already have it, and the world's peoples, the barefoot peoples of the world already have it. And the world is moving forward, and we can move forward too if we join with those civilizations and not like anchor ourselves to like the old Western, just the Western world and the chains of white supremacy. But okay, that was actually my last word. Is there anything you want to say for the roundtable?
I'll only say a little bit because I feel like a good amount of it was covered, but you know, I feel like I'm starting to think about that roundtable as a sort of like challenge to young people, and I guess I see it like I guess like a challenge to like to do, I guess, yeah, like what King was talking about, to like be a good person, like to like live right, and to, I guess, understand like, you know, with this thing about history that like that specifically with King, because like, you know, today I could know that like I'm a human being because like King, like I wouldn't have to be like without those doubts, you know what I mean? But I guess to say that like that's a record of like human potential, I guess, or human capacity. And uh, that's a great thing to know as a young person, you know? And I think another thing too is to say that like, I think it's a challenge, but I would say it's like a form of like motivation because, you know, when you look at, I guess that history specifically, you've seen that people were able to overcome fear, and people were able to really like do amazing things because they had like a greater purpose. And I feel like that's something that we want to say to young people, that like actually like this is where you belong. Like you belong in this type of struggle to like make the world better and to do that. And I guess another thing would be that like I guess another thing would be like this idea that, because there's this like idea of like, I guess dues that we've been talking about, and there's something that like still kind of working out, but there's a certain conception then that like there's a way of like being that you have to give up to like I guess like live or to like kind of like join up in this history, I guess. Um, but yeah, I guess like there's just this thing I want to say like yeah, like this like it belongs to everybody in this country, and I think that that's just something that people have to realize that like actually like this is what it's about. Um, like you could say like this is what life is about. Between that, you know, like that personal, um, that like personal struggle to like be and exist in this world, and to say like actually like that's really tied up in like the overall thing, and I feel like that's kind of I guess one of the things that Ken was talking about. So that's it.
I have just a couple small things, if you don't mind. That part in King's eulogy where he quotes from Hamlet, farewell, sweet prince or dear prince, this idea that James Reed was a prince of the church and a prince of the movement, I think is very important. And I think, this is where the great revolutionaries like King and the historians, the writers of history, are so separate. When you read King, it's almost like you're reading the autobiography of a nation. And we will talk more about that as we go along. But there are very few historians who would refer to James Reed as a prince in the Shakespearean sense. And I think that is kind of, and this is what I was getting from Alice and from you and Nathan, that we're not just trying to capture a past moment, but we're trying to capture the character of the people that made that moment possible. And everything, so much I will say, is saying to young people that you'll never be able to achieve that. What the free school is saying is that that is precisely what we must achieve. And I agree with you completely, Nathan. Until the young generation finds its way back to this, they will be confused. And I agree with it because everything in the culture, the popular culture, the mainstream culture, the universities, are saying to young people, especially the most educated, that the only thing that your life should be about is you and your own comfort, your own comfort, I would say that. And here we're talking about James Reed, Viola Liuzzo, and Aaron Bushnell, but anyway, that's one. The other thing is, why is the free school always going back to churches? Why are we always trying to work with churches, sometimes not successfully? Well, part of our failure, quote unquote, with churches is not our failure, but the failure of the churches to embrace precisely this vision that that we've talked about. The churches have abandoned King, and therefore Christianity is a hollow and empty enterprise of self-righteousness and narcissism. And some of the mainstream denominations have all the most beautiful buildings and nobody in them, and certainly no young people. But we go back to the churches, in a sense, saying that you must recapture the revolutionary spirit. And the two churches for this event, for the 4th and the 6th, the First Unitarian Church, where Martin Luther King heard Mordecai Johnson speak about Gandhi. And King, I would say up to that point, had been a progressive, a socialist, I guess you might say, and an anti-fascist. But he did not have a template of how to move forward. And even then, I'll shut my mouth, I don't want to talk too long. Even then, it took Montgomery, Alabama, and the people of that small town to really give him the opportunity to be who he could potentially be. So it is, I agree with you. He represents something unique in the revolutionary history of this country and of the world. And I know it will not go down well with a lot of young people who disenchanted with Bernie Sanders, disenchanted with so much of the left, who have found, it's Marxism, Leninism, I put quotes here, or communism, or other ideas, and it's all over YouTube. You can listen to them. But why are you missing what is right before you? You're missing what actually has made you you, to the extent that you have fulfilled something of becoming complete. The very thing that has made you you as a young person, you seem to not understand. And so many young people are going everywhere around the world. They're going to postmodernism, they're going to, Judith Butler that we mentioned, searching in all the wrong places.
Yeah.
But I think what we are saying to Zion, to the First Unitarian Church, recapture the revolutionary spirit. And it is not at all unusual that an organization like the Free School with so many young people is saying to the church, which has no young people, this is what we have concluded, that this vision, and this is something, whatever the inspiration for King, and we're talking about King now, to see the world as he did, whatever inspired it, of course, it was a profound learning. Obviously, he studied theology, Paul Tillich, the German socialist Christian theologian. He, in his essay, My Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, he points out how the Western world, Western philosophy, was not adequate for the great task before humanity. And how his theological and religious and social activism brought him to a new vision, which ultimately said that there could not be civil rights without peace.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, having been alive at that time, that it was difficult for people to understand what he was saying. then what do you mean mixing civil rights and the anti-war movement? It was it wasn't just the ruling class who, obviously had their own agenda, but it was ordinary people, civil rights activists, who said, well, we still have so much more to do in the fight for civil rights. So how are you now embracing an even more difficult and even transgressive politically cause, such as the war in Vietnam? Why don't we just stick to civil rights? And that was the argument. And, I guess it was the argument of a people who were still maturing politically and philosophically. The civil rights was an awakening. The Black freedom movement was an awakening. That's why to return to it is not to go back to the past without looking at a future. That awakening, that great awakening, and that's what it was. It awakened the people to what their potential is, which is the highest democratic calling. A revolutionary is not supposed to tell the people. The greatness of any revolutionary movement is to awaken the people to their capacity, just like you said, Nathan, and to awaken the young generation to what their debt is to that moment and what their responsibility is to their future. If you want to be a revolutionary. Now, everybody's not going to be a revolutionary. I'll end on this point that I don't see how we go forward without King. I don't care what movement you look at. Without King, the people cannot move forward. This nation cannot go forward. And without King, well, I guess I feel this way, and I'm not saying anybody else should. Without King, there is no light. You can't see forward. You can't see. It's like somebody turned the lights off in the society. Once King is in the picture, it's illuminating. It's illuminating. And even, I know you were not raised religious. I was raised religious. I am not religious and have not been for a long time. However, I have the deepest respect for the vision of Martin Luther King. And that's why I guess I have found it difficult to join a church. And I'm impatient with the leaders of the church, including the Black church, even though I must say I am just thrilled at 1,000 Black ministers signing a petition calling for ceasefire in Gaza, or the position taken by the leaders of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I'm very thrilled because this is a return to King. But just be consistent with it. Don't just do it for one thing and then invite Biden to your convention. You can't run, as they say, run with the foxes and not with the hounds. You can't ride two horses going in opposite directions. And that's what King said. He said, I'm being morally consistent. If I'm for peace in the United States, I must be for peace in Vietnam. And I'm not going to allow anyone, and this is his language, which I'm always fascinated by, I'm not going to allow anyone to make a butchery of my conscience.
I have one quick comment, just real quick.
Okay.
I think one reason that current day, the Black community doesn't see King as revolutionary, I've heard it said that many people think that King led us into a burning building. integration. So that might be something for our group to explore if these things come up as to why. It seems the Black community doesn't see King any longer as a Christian because of all we lost, or we seem to have lost through integration. But our communities used to thrive when we were self-contained. So that's one of the thoughts out there about King now, is that integration thing didn't really work well for us.
If I might just say one thing, Rhonda, you know, that was, you know, those, I remember these arguments as they continue today. I know many Black people who consider themselves revolutionaries in particular, and certainly Black nationalists. You know, a lot of, well, but a lot of them oppose King anyway, if you think about it. That, and then of course, with the rise of postmodernism, various forms of feminism and other gender ideologies, and then of course, a form of cultural nationalism and Afrocentricity that, well, let me just, if I could just say, sometimes it's very hard to understand the genealogy of ideas among Black folk, and the contest of ideas. And in this contest of ideas, the ideology, let us say, of Afrocentrism on the one side, of cultural nationalism, and then, of course, a kind of Black radical feminism, has undermined the fullest understanding of what the struggle was about. So for the Afrocentrists, the Black cultural nationalists, this could never have been anything but a failure because we African Americans have failed to understand our center, our cultural center, which is not in this country, but is in Africa. And so it would appear that through that interpretation that King failed. When King was not trying, this idea of integration was a phrase, a word put upon the movement against segregation. And it was not to, quote, integrate into a failed society, but in the process to radically change the society. I think King is so misunderstood.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? And this is why, I mean, you just can't begin to understand the intentionality of it. I mean, you can go to African American studies courses in any university and seldom will King be discussed, maybe in a religion department. But in African American studies, the assumption is it was a failure. Integration is not what the movement was about. And that is a smear placed upon the movement to say that, well, it wanted us literally to, quote, assimilate and become white. That is not, I mean, if that were the case, why would he be marching with the sanitation workers? Why would he call for a movement against poverty, war, and racism? Why would he even have to give this speech that we're celebrating? Why would he? That is a painful speech. And yeah, but that's what I'm saying. I think the recovery of King from his detractors is among the most important ideological struggles for the American people and for the young generation. We just can't go forward. We can have large demonstrations, and I hope we have more. And I hope there's one at the Democratic National Convention that shuts it down. But that is not enough.
Can I say something?
Wait, I wanted to talk about that part in Beyond Vietnam where King talks about how the Vietnamese must think of Americans as strange liberators, you know, and he spends a lot of time in it. And I think it only made sense to me right now, reading it as we're preparing for the event, also how deliberate and how deep that was. Because this is also something that Baldwin does. He always talks about how the American, say the American traveling to Europe, how does he appear to a European person, or how does he appear to anybody who's not American, who comes from a different civilizational or historical process. And I know when I came here first, it was very hard for me to understand or immediately like catch the pulse of American society. And I think all of this is only making sense to me now, reading King and reading Baldwin, because there is that question of how does the American see himself or herself in the context of the world's people, and there's this idea that I think is inculcated amongst American people that you can really be separate. Like you can be a thing in yourself and not feel what King is saying of this universal brotherhood of man. Like you or Baldwin is saying that every human being is every other human being, if you really think about it. Like I could be you and you could be me, whatever that me is. And I feel like when King makes this, what you were also saying, Doc, this thing about civil rights and peace, well, the question of civil rights, the rights your government owes you because you're a citizen of this country, if you're fighting for that right, well, then, I mean, you have to understand what King is saying is also then think of the world. Every human being in this world, somebody in Gaza right now, also has certain rights because they're a citizen of this world. And American foreign policy, a lot of it, when they claim to go to defend democracy and human rights elsewhere, well, isn't peace a human right? Like, don't children deserve peace as a fundamental right that makes their future possible? And so, if that compromise were to be made, that you had a struggle for civil rights without a struggle for peace everywhere in the world, well, it's almost like shutting the door on Americans ever being able to join hands with world humanity. Because, yes, so you would have like incremental rights given to American citizens, you black folk, and all of that. But you wouldn't become a nation, which Emily was also saying. Baldwin calls it achieving your nation, King calls it the beloved community. And this is why, I mean, this last week I've also been thinking a lot about how do you talk about a new American people? Like, where do you start? Like, why new? Like, why are we talking about a new American people? I think it's that. It also reminds me of that, is that a new American people who can join hands with world humanity at last, which almost criminally they have been kept away from. Like the door to the World House has been shut on their face by this idea that just by being American you can be separate from the rest of the world. But that's something I was thinking about.
Okay. I just wanted to say something. I feel like this question about integration got me thinking that I know that in The Fire Next Time, in the part that Baldwin goes and meets the Honorable Minister Elijah Muhammad, and he's thinking about his conversation with Elijah Muhammad, and it's really interesting. And that is where the line comes, if I remember correctly, do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? And I feel like a lot of people take that sentence out of context and say that, okay, Baldwin was also not an integrationist. Like, he did not want integration because he felt like 400 years of Negro struggle should not end with this level of American society. And so it is better to be separate. But I feel like that is also
a little bit of a misunderstanding of what Baldwin meant, because in the same essay, well, in the letter to my nephew, he talks about integration, and he says that, if integration means anything, it means that we, with love, will force our brothers to see themselves as they are, and accept the reality. And he tells his 14-year-old nephew that this is your home, this is your land, do not be driven from it. And I feel I feel like he does want integration, but on new standards, which is always what we talk about. There has to be a new standard for society, and Black people are the way to get to it, because he says that the future of America is as bright as the future of the Negro, right? And so he is seeing American society as um, the future of Black people. He is seeing that he is envisioning an America with higher standards, where Black people and white people live like brothers, and they help elevate each other and their consciousness and their um, and so I feel like, in the same vein, even King, who talked about integration, he was imagining it in the same way. And yeah, I mean, I wanted to add that. I don't think that this burning house concept, which I have read a lot of articles about, Baldwin talks about America as a burning house. Why would we want to be integrated in it? I don't think um, it was out of context. It's out of context. He's thinking about something different with respect to the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad. Yeah.
Yeah, because I've been looking at the flyer.
I was just looking at that.
Yeah, because I don't know how. Well, let's not start there, but like the words we put together for the title of our event, America's Revolutionary Future. What is America? What do we mean by revolutionary? Like future, like these are almost words that we are injecting meaning into, and almost also giving it a sense of life. I don't think that it would be easy to put these words together without all the time that we have spent. Because I agree with you, Shantanu, actually, that let's get to what our event, like the essence of the event is. Let's get to thinking about like what is right, how we feel about really our place, our role in the world. Meaning, like, it's one thing for all of these ad hominem attacks on King to persist, but it's another thing to know why they persist in the first place, like we're saying. Meaning that there is a deliberate assault, a deliberate continual assassination on King. Can we focus on that first? Why do we need to have justifications? Why do we need to keep beating around a certain problem that we're all facing, which is the external and internal moral crisis that happens when we haven't yet decided on what America is, who we are as people? Because I think these three words, for me, matter. As an old or young person, a future matters. As an old or young person, revolutionary is not simply just a soul, like, I aspire to talk in front of people. I aspire to, it's about changing really how we act in this world, what this world will become, in a sense. And if you think you know what America is, why don't you tell me that and we can discuss? instead of assuming that we all are talking about the exact same place. Fact is that when we've been reading, like I know free school has also been through a lot. And it'll continue to go through a lot because I think we are all a certain type of pressure cooker. Like it is a word that I want to use because I feel like in me when I'm by myself is like everybody else in free school. Like what would they do? Where I am located, I have no idea. But the fact is that when I at least come here, I know I'm home, which means that, you know, I'm not really, I didn't plan to be who I am now. You know what I'm saying? You can't really plan that. You can only really plan to be a good and honest person. And I agree that there is some talking to do about the relationship between Baldwin and King. And what that means in specifics, I think in like what I appreciated what you had read, Alice, is the fact of it's neither a system exactly that we're looking for, but morality is also something that you can live by and make into a certain type of organized or it functions in the world. So that means something different. That, I mean, like this is saying that I'm not living by a certain dogma. I don't think that King, if I read the words of King, I would just spew what he says because I think if he said it, then it is right. But it's a matter of what he is saying. And I think having a creative synthesis in the mind also affects how we're thinking about like what we mean by faith and this attempt of bringing King really to, or back to us all. And I think honestly that I'd rather just focus on the event and what we are trying to do. Another thing that I was reading recently was in like King's Strength to Love. And I was just going through it because we've gone through it a number of times. But I just know that the philosophical, ideological, the moral, like scientific, are all things to really be worked out in a more specific way. Like the empire of eternity and the colony of time. What King is also asserting is that we live in both. And that also means that the human capacity, the human dimensions, what are people able to do, are really, it really is on a different playing field. And I've been thinking about that as really interesting. The other thing is about the artist, because I think that we were really kind of messed up around how we think about artists. And I think it is true that the artist is a representation of the self, or like what everybody really is striving to be. And I think that that is also scientific and it has both structure in it and working itself out, because I feel like we're all working, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like the essence of the discovery of the self is also the essence of really what we're all striving to really do, if we're honest and we're loyal, at least to the project. And I think I wanted to mention that because, like we said, another point of contention is that Baldwin is just either a gay writer or, you know what I'm saying? Like the lives between King and Baldwin are so different. But I think both men were talking about new human beings. And in so doing, they are configuring the artist as part of this quality of moving forward history. And so there's a lot to really uncover again in the philosophical in attempts, because I think, like we said a couple of weeks ago, like how much this event, okay, I really do think that this event is almost a culmination of something. And I feel like we're at a moment where this will also decide the summer documentary series and then the kind of the August event in a way. Like, I think that there's something about King, you know what I'm saying? And so I think what I mean is, when we're in a way using, but reading, understanding, talking so much as we do, working out our ideas, working out our articles, working out our art, constantly trying to apply things in our lives, like you had mentioned already, Alice. I don't mean to repeat, but I'm just trying to underscore the reason even at all why we do this is because, like, while uncovering King, and this is just something to say, while uncovering King, we uncover something about ourselves, how we really see the world. And I think that's also what's important about what you're saying, Rhonda, which is really not even about, like, quote unquote old people at all, but it's just to say something about, or like, or even about what people would say about King. I think what's more important is the fact that right now, like, there's this thing about time, that doesn't wait. There's this thing about time that keeps moving, or you have to go, like, there's just something about time. And in a sense, I want to easily say that it is the right time. There's something about the quality that you either adhere to or that really stays, in a sense, the same. Like, I don't think that King is estranged from this time, you know what I mean? And at the same time, I also think that since we are not physically with him, we have to decide on almost extremely serious subjects that we thought could have been on maybe King's shoulders. And I think that's also, that's why I'm responding the way I am, and why this event might be important. Yeah.
I don't know if you're asking yourself the question.
I don't know.
But Eddie and I, as you guys know, I've been going to Mass number 12 for the self-development reading. And I think as someone who has observed other people in the preschool read Baldwin, that I can say that reading Baldwin is an exercise of self-discovery. And in the study guide that the Nation of Islam reads, there was this line that stuck out to me that said, in a sense, it's every individual counts. They're counting every individual of the nation as a cumulative sum of the human potential. And the purpose of the Nation of Islam is to go out into the community and, as I said before, resurrect people so they can increase that potential. And I see that as, like, something that we're doing with the event too. The preschool has always done to increase the capacity of young people to achieve, everything that they can achieve, or to achieve their debt, to achieve this task. But it made me think about what Malcolm X said to the FBI when they visited him. I'm nothing but a humble creature. And the way that, you know, James Reed, just being a humble preacher, going to the South. And I'd once read that the definition of a revolutionary is sort of, not the definition, but a revolutionary is sort of a doctor for society, someone that heals society. And that's what Baldwin is doing when he's doing, that's what Baldwin is doing when he's writing, is it's not just for the purpose of writing as a sentimental love story, but writing about these human questions in a deep way. And yeah, and then just to wrap up quickly, I mean, Minister Rodney, he one day during the Sunday sermon, he said that he was talking about Mao and the drug crisis in Kensington, and he said, how did the Chinese handle a drug crisis? They had the Opium Wars. Mao, shut that shit down, in his own words, maybe not his own words, but he said, I have a little red book. I got it in Chicago from the Black Panthers. It's 40 years old. And, in the little red book, Mao Zedong says, the spirit of the people can move Mount high. And that's always, it's always moved me, but it's always been a departure from Marxism that I haven't been able to explain, using any Western philosophy or using any Marxist philosophy. And so I guess I mean to say, people like Martin Luther King, people like the Nation of Islam, people like James Baldwin, they consider themselves to be doctors for society, to heal the people who are wounded. Like what Alice said, like, do you believe that there's a balm in Gilead that can make a wounded person whole? And that's the first question. So what we're really getting at is like, okay, what is that balm? But the first question is, okay, do you believe in that balm? Like, do you really believe that we can make society whole again? I guess that sort of touches what Rhonda said about, did we integrate into a burning house?
Well, I think it's also a really interesting question, because all of us, as part of the Year of Baldwin, I think there is that element of self-examination. And what's obvious is that many of us, our ancestors are not from this country. And so, like, I think, or what I'm trying to say is that for Black people in this country, when there's the question of integration, it's to what Tony, you were saying earlier, which is, what is your genealogy? Because even if you were a nation within a nation, the history of Black people in this country has been to transform the society back through Civil War and Reconstruction up to the Civil Rights Movement. Because if you were to say that Black people are going to remain a separate people, that actually contradicts the history of Black people in this country, which is that they've always been part of this country. And then it also gets to the roots of, it's about, like, even when it was segregated, there was a sense that it's not because you chose to be segregated, but actually everything was separate and not equal. And King, like, because I'm trying to understand King, where you see him as such a perfect figure, that you forget that, because I was even telling Emily, I was like, oh, we're not King. But then as I was reading, like, the early parts of his life, I was like, wait, actually, he's kind of just like us, in a sense of, he grew up, he studied, he was in the church, he questioned, like, the church as well. And he was into pretty girls too. And then even with Coretta, he was like, I was getting cynical, but then my friend hooked me up with Coretta, and I was like, wow. But yeah, like, I think what he was saying also is that for Black people in this country, the history and the instinct has been to create a more just society. And I think as part of that, connected to that, I've also been reflecting on my personal experience too, like growing up in a Chinatown in America, where I do feel very comfortable going back to, like, a Chinese community where I'm familiar with, where my parents come from. But I also know that actually there's a greater demand for Chinese Americans in the society, where you can't just live in that bubble where even in Chinatown in New York City, you start to see the homelessness crisis. Like there are people on the streets who are homeless, and it's part of, you can't really be in a bubble because you're part of American society. And actually, there's something where you will, there are days where you'll have to leave that Chinatown to go into, I don't know, Manhattan, or where there are white people in mainstream society, and you know actually that you're lesser than when you, or you have a sense that you're lesser than when you go to those places. And so, and even for, like, I've been thinking a lot about, like, that Chinese community has given me a lot, but it's also a delusion actually that you can stay in there, because your children's children can't stay in there forever. And there's also a greater calling to become part of this country, where right now that Chinatown, it's not speaking up against the war in Gaza. Like it's part of the deal that you have to make, which is that you can have your Chinatown where you have your businesses, you can have something that's not white, but you shut up about everything else in society. And actually, there's something that I don't know, like there's still an immigrant population, but their children will have to deal with it, which is me and I guess I don't know, whatever. But which is that the question that young children, like my parents immigrated here, but what happens to the children? They will have to answer the question of, like, can actually Chinese Americans be better than this? Which is that they will have to answer the question of what it means to be part of this American democracy, and what is that American democracy going to look like? Are Chinese Americans going to be shaped by it, or are they going to stand up and be courageous and be part of shaping that community, broader American society? I think that's also why King and Baldwin are so interesting, because Black people in this country have asked that question. And it's allowed me to reflect a lot about, like, who the people I come from and where I grew up, and make sense of, like, why is it that when King and his father went downtown looking for shoes, they were like, oh, you have to go to the other counter. And the father was like, no, I'm not going to accept this. And he just leaves. And I think that's the demand too through this event, because we will have Cambodian dancers, Korean drummers, and many of us here are also like immigrants or children of immigrants. Like, what is that revolutionary future? And what is that greater demand?
Okay, I was starting to read some Baldwin, and this discussion kind of reminded me of a quote I read. It goes, "America, a country devoted to the death of paradox, may therefore be put to death by one."
Could you read it one more time?
Yeah, America, a country devoted to the death of paradox, may therefore be put to death by one. And in relation to King, King was a philosopher, I guess, who wanted to lead people and not mislead. And I'm just kind of looking at some of my notes here, and he wanted to be a ruler who leads with the light of the revealed paradox. And, I understand the pessimism from the, I guess, post-King movement, but I think the most important thing he did was try to lead with this paradox and not try to reject the paradox that we live in, because if you reject the paradox, it's just as paradoxical, if not more paradoxical, than the paradox itself. And it's not too confusing. Yeah, that's just a short thought I had about that.
I think this I was thinking of, the whole conversation was also very moving, but I think this is something also to do with the quote you were reading, this question of paradox, which I guess one way to think about it is as contradictions, and how I've been listening to a lot of King's speeches the entire week, and mostly the earlier ones like Drum Major Instinct or the Blueprint speech, where he is mostly talking to his audience, and um, in one community. And the thing that really stands out, that really stood out, was how much of an intimate knowledge he had of the people he's speaking to. And especially in the drum major where he's talking about, oh yes, I know that you sometimes want to be able to afford Cadillacs, or you want to be able to afford this or that. And what he's really saying is, it seems that he knows the most private thoughts of people in his audience, and he has, like, he somehow found a way to talk about it. And in the way he talks about it, it seems that he's able to show them like a different way of being. He's able to show that, okay, we can be different. And this, like, listening to like to him speaking like that today, it's really humbling, because I don't think it's easy to understand people like that. And I think it takes a certain kind of price you have to pay, and a way to understand yourself before you can understand, you can begin understanding other people. And I was thinking of this also as I was talking about, this question of like how King says that, I'm also a sinner like you. And this question of how like the question of the sin or sainthood, like he talks about, and how this is not like this does not lead us to a way forward, but we have to we have to be able to work out our relationship with sin. And how he says that the question of, like, we don't have to concern ourselves with the eradication of sin, we have to concern ourselves with overcoming it. And like I was thinking that this is why the like yes, I agree that reading like Baldwin and King really seem to be two sides of the same coin, because seeing them together, they they almost seem to complement each other in a way where like Baldwin is really giving us a way forward to talk about the question of sin in in the language of the modern world, where we talk about the question of the individual searching for meaning. And therefore sin is not something that's to be found outside. It's not something that lies outside of you. And therefore this question of, I guess, the question of the paradox or the contradiction, it does begin with the person, it does begin with the individual. And like King and Baldwin seems to offer a way forward to how to deal with that contradiction in yourself, how to look at yourself as where this contradiction needs to be solved. And I was thinking that the whole question of opposition to King, or okay, yes, this is a leader that has led us into the burning house, and how a big part of the left sees King today is basically okay. You like, this is the civil rights movement. So if we stand with King? I'm remembering uh, like a question that came up last year at our Du Bois reconstruction event, the question of responsibility. And are we prepared to take the kind of responsibility when we stand with King? And I think to be able to answer this question, one has to see that the contradiction does not lie outside. The contradiction of like, what does it mean to be a moral person? What does it mean to be be a revolutionary agent? This does not lie outside in society. It has to begin with the person. And I think Baldwin and King together, they give a framework that they give this framework of like, what does it mean? Like, why does King talk about what it means to be what it means to be creatively maladjusted to evil? He's not saying, and I think what he's saying is that like, I'm thinking of it in terms of what it means for us, what it means for like today, for a generation, which like, to be prepared to pay your dues for the future means you're prepared to be forever maladjusted to an immoral society. And I think there is a price to pay. There is a kind of like there is a kind of schizophrenia, like there is a kind of schizophrenia in society where, especially especially in a society which is, which is concerned with words like democracy and integration, and also concerned with, war all over the world, there is a schizophrenia that the society breeds. But then being maladjusted to it also means that you have a price to pay. You have to be that you have to be um, like you have to live with this kind of tension, which King talks about, this tension of like this tension in society, but this tension in you, this tension like this tension of being constantly having to live with and attempt to resolve these contradictions. And this is not something you resolve and move forward. You resolve it every single day. Um, and yeah, I think like there is a price to pay, like, because the generation today, which is going to be prepared to bring the future into being, to bring a revolutionary future into being, will have to pay a price. And the future is uncertain. The future is going to be uncertain. And I think we have to, I think what I'm really thinking about in terms of the event and this conversation is that we don't have formulas of how to be. We don't have formulas for what the right way of being is, and we really have like King and Baldwin to look to, we have to look to them as the only anchor, as as anchors for our time. Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to, yeah.
Something Alice was sharing, and also Tony and others, makes me think differently about the word integration, or the question of King as an integrationist, where now I'm starting to think of it not as King wanting to assimilate or bring Black Americans into a burning building, but his challenge is to America to integrate itself. A reverse for America to integrate itself into a world humanity, a world house. That agonizing process. And for me, there's a connection there between that and what you were sharing, Emily, about the life of James Reed, of coming up against some higher standard or some different standard and challenging yourself to integrate into that standard, of coming up against some fork in the road and having to make a moral choice. I think it's similar to what you're saying of the internal and the external moral choice, coming to confronting that and having to make a decision about that. And I hope, Emily, that like something of that comes through in the panel. Like even what you shared was so beautiful and so powerful. I think really articulates the debt and the dues that we have to pay as a young generation.
Can I add on one more? Yeah, it's just I feel that since the passing of King, and I can even say since the fall of the Eastern Bloc, USSR, we kind of like lost sight of the paradox that King was trying to lead us with. And yeah, it's just like, last thing I'll say is it's just like super important for this generation, people who are here now, to try to pick back up where we left off. I'm sorry, one more thought. Yeah, just as time goes on, paradox gets obscured, and that's kind of the essence of what I was trying to say. Sorry.
No, thanks. All right. I've been trying to get a sense of this, what we've been talking about for paying dues. I remember the first time I actually heard this, a sense of anyone who told me that I had a serious responsibility to society was actually at Cornell, when you guys had that your inescapable responsibility event. And I was a little put off by the title, I have to be honest with you, because I mean, the title words. I was like, what do you mean I have a responsibility? Like, I'm just trying to make it. I'm just worried about me right now. It's hard out here. And it reminds me of like being a kid where your mom's like, you better do the dishes, boy, and you're like, I don't want to do the dishes, and you don't realize just how much your parents do for you to make your life wonderful, and you have the least bit of responsibility to do something in your house, and when I think about like paying dues, oh, I'm sorry, and then when you get older, you realize how much your parents done for you, and you're like, wow, you know, I want to take care of my parents, I want to be good to my family. I feel like the sense, or that I feel like the American people have this kind of realization, similar realization to make of, wow, you don't realize, and instead of I've inherited this like very heavy debt, I don't realize what incredible possibilities I've actually inherited that I have a responsibility towards to really fulfill them. And it's really for my benefit. Washing those dishes is for your benefit. Unlocking the capacity of the American people is for all us to benefit. And because experienced it, we've experienced the realization of so many possibilities to begin with. That gives you the urgency to want to do that for the next generation and pay it forward. I mean, really, I guess off-putted feeling that I had before. I really feel like that's the kind of ideology of the ruling class, with this kind of selfishness. I mean, they do it on like a super grand scale. I'm at where like you'll be like Joe Biden. You know, you try to send your kids to boarding school in like the woods, removed from society, where you then proceed to destroy the country that you live in and think that you can get away with it, that you can shield yourself from any consequences, because you have a house in the suburbs and you send your kids in the woods until you find out you're like a kid like Hunter Biden is got all kinds of problems and is a menace to society and himself, and you end up paying that consequence. And so that that's the more extreme sense, but I feel like that is the kind of thinking that is directed to young people and the American people, especially because I mean life is hard, man. Just taking care of your own is not a trivial matter, but really your life is so much more greater than that. And I can, I guess you can say that to somebody. You can say that to somebody, and why would you want to disagree with that? But then when it's articulated by a king, you can truly like, feel it in your heart, and then he makes it possible to actualize that feeling and elevate it to changes in your personal life, and then changes to your society. So I'm more into this concept of debt or a due to society after having gone through this reflection.
No, what I was thinking about was connected to like, actually I first started thinking about it when Alice had spoken in the beginning, but also after Shimbarta you had spoken, because when you had said like King's mastery was in how intimately he spoke to his people and how he was able to capture some of the most private, like, right, something very basically like the private life of the Black proletariat, and to articulate it, and then to articulate a path forward. Like, it also made me think of Baldwin, because I think Baldwin shares that same quality, which is also why we look to him, where he like his autobiography is also an autobiography of the American people. But I was thinking about it because since Alice, you had spoken, like well, it made me think about this line from Baldwin somewhere where he says, what you have, like you can only have what you think you have by letting it go. And he said, you could have spent your whole life working for a house, but then one day you have to realize it doesn't belong to you. Even your children, like they don't belong to you. And then I had also thought of which other people had brought up King's speech, like what is your life's blueprint? But basically what I'm trying to wrap my head around is why they both shared this message for the American people that is basically about how do you live life? And like, how do you say, because Baldwin also has that phrase, which he uses in his novels and his essays, like to say yes to life. Like, I feel like they both place this very historically unique demand on their people. And I don't know if any world leader or like world historic artist or writer has ever articulated a demand in this way where you're basically urgently telling all frontiers of like your people that they have to learn what it means to actually live. And so it's not a complete thought because I think it's also connected to what we've been saying about what the task for paying our dues will be, but I'm trying to understand what all of this like means. And I think part of it is a testament to how America is a civilization yet unmade, and yet it will be a civilization like no other. And the type of demand that is being placed on the human being will break something like for the history of the world if it is crossed. No, I don't know, like my mind is just really on that point for some reason where like that language of life comes up again and again, or when King says like a nation that year after year spends more on material destruction than it does on like economic programs is quickly approaching spiritual death. Or when Baldwin says, yeah, like the European nations are real white nations, but ours is to be the last white nation. Like, you know, I don't feel like European leaders speak to their people this way because a Spanish person, a French person already assumes they know how to live life. Like you go to the terrace and you drink your espresso and then you like pick up a baguette on your way home and you enjoy it and you break bread with your family. Like that is life. That is the crystallization of like that life. And I don't feel that paradigm is before us in any way yet. Like, this is just the way that I made sense of what a lot of people were saying.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I think part of the discussion is everything, the language that's big, and then like and this thing about love. And I think that's also part of what we're throwing around, contradictions or paradox, because I think, you know, with King, he knows, and similarly said, like you had just mentioned, with the economic, we're approaching spiritual death. With hate, your personality becomes divided, like your personality becomes divided. But love is a unifying thing. And I think what's so funny about that is that, like, there is something that happened to people in this country when another man is not known in the head or the heart as a man because he's Black, and vice versa. What does that happen to white people? And we've discussed this a lot. But this thing about love, and is also kind of like that helps me understand better what I've been reflecting on too, and also why this whole event is so significant. It is not solely just like, oh wow, like, you know, another event on King or another event that we do on King, you know, but it is about saying and standing by what we're saying. That despite it all, like all the shit that we got through to get here, like personally or our families, or, you know what I'm, like all of it, or even despite that, this country has the audacity to attempt to kill a dream or a hope or its actual potential. We are instead saying, like, this is like in the same vein. We cannot live without this memory. We cannot live without this knowledge, without this attempt at life. which is to say that because we love you all, or I love you all, or like that we continue with King. Like it wasn't enough for me to just say like, well, this event is important because it's King, because it's free school, but it's important to say strictly that like we will not live. Like, do you know what that means to not to live? It's just a funny thing. And we won't be able to be free. Like, do you know what that means? And this is like to say with all poetics and all meaning that I know I want to. And I know that really it is the only possibility. So I have to at least be honest with how we got here. And no, I appreciate what you said. I really do.
Yeah, well, I think another way to formulate the question is like, why does the private life of the American people matter as much as it does? Because that's precisely what King and Baldwin were articulating.
Yeah.
And it was a demand for their respective audiences. Well, even when Baldwin describes King and the movement as taking the territory of the political struggle into the human heart, like I'm trying to understand what that really means.
Yeah, I think you were referring to the essay. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the essay that you quoted from, where he says, like, you basically only understand what life is once you realize that everything you had, like your house or your kids, is actually not yours. And then that's where he also talks about emotional kindergarten.
What essay is it?
It's the artist's struggle.
Yeah. I just
and he says, and this is where the whole question in my own private personal case of being an American artist, of being not yet 65 years old, and of being an American Negro artist in 1963, in this most peculiar of countries, begins to be a very frightening assignment. One is dealing all the time with the most inarticulate people that I, in any case, have ever encountered. And I don't hesitate to say the most inarticulate group of people we are ever likely to encounter, I or anybody else, for a very long time, at least in this century. Inarticulate and illiterate, and they're very particular and difficult to describe away, unlettered in the language, which may sound a little florid, but there's no other way that I can think of to say it. Totally unlettered in the language of the heart, totally distrustful of whatever cannot be touched, panic-stricken at the very first hint of pain, a people determined to believe that they can make suffering obsolete, who don't understand yet a very physiological fact, that the pain which signals a toothache is a pain which saves your life.
Yes.
This is very frightening. It frightens me half to death. And I'm not talking now merely about race, and I'm certainly not talking merely about Southerners. I'm talking really about 2/3 of my public and technical allies. People who believe that segregation is wrong. People who march on picket lines who have yet overlooked something else and are still under the illusion, I think, that what they've overlooked has something to do with social questions, and in my particular case anyway, that it has something to do with Negroes. I would like to live long enough, don't misunderstand me, but I would like to live long enough to see that word or the use to which is struck from the American vocabulary. In effect, there is no Negro problem. The problem is that one is still in a kindergarten, an emotional kindergarten, and the Negro in this country operates as some weird kind of gorilla who suddenly is breaking up all the blackboards. I'm tired not only of being told to wait, but of people saying, what should I do? They mean, what should I do about the Negro problem? What should I do for you? There's nothing you can do for me. There's nothing you can do for Negroes. It must be done for you. One is not attempting to save 22 million people. One is attempting to save an entire country, and that means an entire civilization. And the price for that is high. The price for that is to understand oneself. The price for that, for example, is to recognize that most of us, white and black, have arrived at a point where we do not know what to tell our children. Most of us have arrived at the point where we still believe and insist on and act on the principle, which is no longer valid, that this is such and such an optimum, that our choice is the lesser of two evils, and that this is no longer true. Gonorrhea is not preferable to syphilis.
Right.
The time has come, it seems to me, to recognize the framework in which we operate weighs on us too heavily to be borne, and is about to kill us. It is a time to ask very hard questions and to take very rude positions, and no matter at what price. But yeah, but that's to say, like, I actually completely agree with this thing that only in America is exactly the American problem, but also the American hope.
Yeah.
That like your private life is in fact already a political struggle.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and it's like what we said in the vision statement, where it's like the reason why Baldwin writes novels is not because he likes being a novelist, but he writes these characters so realistically because he's describing the psychoses and the way different people are impacted by an unjust, oppressive society. And it's exactly the way, let's say, like people get addicted to heroin, or it's exactly the way people become schizophrenic in this country, the way we have such a high rate of mental illness. It's not because like we've inbred for so long that we've produced like mental illnesses,
Right.
because
Right.
there's something wrong with the society. And so until like individuals realize, it's the way Baldwin always connects, like it's the way Baldwin connects what he calls like exactly your view of politics, like American foreign policy, domestic politics, is exactly tied to your sense of identity. And like, and the reason why King is so dangerous is because King brings the democratic struggle, the political struggle, the struggle of a nation into the domain of every individual's will, of like whether they make a moral choice or not. And like you said, like I think, okay, in France, for example, there's that term je ne sais quoi, right? What does that mean again? It means like life or something.
It means like
Oh, sorry, c'est la vie. C'est la vie. Wait, c'est la vie is like that's life. Like in France, they're like, yeah, like life, you know, life, c'est la vie, whatever. Like, oh, that's life, c'est la. Like, you don't have a term for that in America. Like, I feel like Du Bois was like, the most American thing you can do is say, so what? Like, or like say, like, or anyways, I forget where I was going with this. But the point is that, yeah, I agree that that's why, and I also think part of, at least for my panel, is to make the point that, like, to say, for example, the crisis of the church is not really just about the institution, it's a crisis of meaning. It's a reflection of a crisis of an American people who are struggling with an assignment that they don't realize that they've been given. Like the way Baldwin talks about, like, each of us have an assignment. Or, for example, like something we want to talk about, which is another way of saying something we want to raise on the April 4th panel, responding to Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, is that in fact, despite how much people talk about revolution this, revolution that, blah, 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 is that actually the revolutionary imperative is the moral imperative. Or reverse it, the moral imperative is the revolutionary imperative. And that's why Baldwin always talks about, like, the question is not, do we have enough intelligence to get our way out? He says, do we have the moral stamina? The moral stamina to find our way out. Like, are we invested morally enough? Do we care enough? Do we love enough? Like, do we, like, all of that to find our way out? Oh yeah, back to the burning house, by the way. So I actually really like the question too, like bringing that up, because sometimes I also get confused where I feel like I've been in my, like, mind for so long that I forget that people say stuff like that. That actually there is this like trend, like this, like King would say, this rotten piece of meat that has been fed to people after King's assassination deliberately, to basically smear King, to say like, well, didn't he contribute to everything we've lost? And first of all, actually, like, King is not the reason why jobs were sent to China. Like, King is not the reason why there's poverty, or that there's music, like music that calls people bees and hoes. And that's not King's fault. And also, King, when he talked about, I'm afraid of integrating my people into a burning house, like, he and Harry Belafonte talked about it afterwards, where King was like, when you look at the burning house, the only choice you have is to be the fireman. Like, it's to be the fireman to put out the fire. Like, the problem is not really just the house itself. The problem is that the house is on fire, and everyone's just watching it burn.
Exactly.
And so, are you gonna put the fire out, or are you gonna say, yeah, like, let's light this whole shit on fire? Like, let's go all the way, burn the fucking thing. But you can't, because, like Baldwin says, what about the child? Like, what about the kid? Like, okay, you don't like your life, but what about the kid? What about the kid in Gaza? Because then it does become this very existentialist civilizational question, which I'm really obsessed with, which is like, I'm really obsessed with the word eternal. And it's not because I want to be immortal. Like, I don't want to be like immortal, but it's this question of like the thing worth, I think we talked about this, that the only thing worth living for is not like your concrete flesh in of itself, because you're going to die one day. And even your kids like are going to die one day. And then you keep going along. Well, everyone's grandkids are going to die one day. The question is like, are you going to live, like have something worth living for that's beyond the material? That's the eternal. Like in some ways, that's the crux of civilization. Like, the pursuit of something that lasts longer, and it's not tied to materialism. It's tied to like spirit or values, or like being able to produce beauty that doesn't come from like that doesn't come from abstract, shiny, jiggy thingies, but actually comes from the beauty of like the ground, the beauty of people, ordinary people. And yeah, but I thought the integration question was super interesting, because in some ways, I feel like I think the genealogy of the claim that King was an integrationist is one thing, but I also think when you get deeper at young people's nihilism, like I think even get deeper, there is the question of also young people's nihilism of like, was King a like it's the question. If you think King, if you want to basically be like King doesn't matter, let's just say King doesn't matter. Like all of that didn't matter. We're fucked. The Iraq War happened, and now we're in Russia and Ukraine and Gaza. Then you're basically in some ways, and if your next question is not, well, what can I do? What should I do? Like, okay, the house is on fire. Are you just going to stand there or what? Then it does come to a question of basic optimism or nihilism. Like, is there a future? Is there a sky? Is there actually a future worth fighting for? And I feel like that's the task of the April 6th roundtable too. It's like a very multi-layered, multi-dimensional question of, well, do you want to save a life or not? Save your own life and save other people's lives. Like, if not your own life, what about the children in Gaza's lives? If not your own life, well, what about like your friend or whoever you hold dear or whoever you hold precious's life? But I hope at the very basic level, like you seek to save your own life, which is also to contribute to saving America's life. Yeah, a good one.
Well, I also wanted to, I know we were like technically supposed to do it for the agenda, but I also wanted to connect it to Avant Garde. But first to say that I think I really liked also when Alice read at the beginning that King quote about there's like a civil war happening inside every person, and yeah, this is just restating things that you guys have said already, but that part of the task that we have undertaken is basically like it's still true. Like every person right now living in American society like is undergoing that kind of civil war and is at war and is in battle with forces that are both seen and unseen. And like every person is experiencing that and is finding some way of either acquiescing or like trying to fight in the midst of it. And part of what we're trying to do is to bring the battle to the surface in the same way that King in nonviolent through nonviolence, it's like we're going to bring the tensions that are already there in America, specifically around segregation and Jim Crow and all that stuff. We're going to bring all those tensions to the surface. And part of what we're doing with this event and also in general with our with the journal and everything the Free School is doing, we're trying to bring all of that stuff to the surface so people can actually engage in that battle in like actual community with people, but also to do it in a way where you actually have to confront it openly. Because I think the danger is that like if everyone feels like they're going through this kind of like secret battle in themselves or the secret war, it's like, yeah, people like lose their lives because of that. And it's both like a very obvious ways, like with like gun violence and the drug epidemic and all that stuff, but it's also in like more subtle ways. And I think also like I wanted to talk about this question of individual too, because I think part of it was that like it's like America first is like founded as almost like the dream of the Enlightenment or like the fulfillment of the Enlightenment in Europe, but it's like the American ideology or the American experiment is like, can you create an entire nation like a social compact, which is also elevating the individual, right? And it's like the irony of it, which I think is what people were talking about, but like the irony of it, which Baldwin in particular I think brings out, is this thing of like America is the nation which is the first to say that it prizes the individual, but is the nation which most disgraces and demeans and does not honor the actual individual, and in which it is the most difficult to achieve an actual individual personality. And because King also talks about that, like I think both of them, like in particular, they recognize the importance of like what they call like the personality of the individual, where it's like part of what Jim Crow did, in particular, I think in the South, was like it was such an affront to everyone's basic sense of like almost like individual like moral sense. Like it was such an affront to like I don't know, just the basic logic of and I think the thing is like that's what Baldwin's saying is like people know that it's wrong. Like white people know that it's wrong, and yet they're fleeing from it. And this is what robs the white man of his moral authority, basically. And at the same time, it was also something that was basically affronting Black people, and it's being like, why on earth are we like willing to submit to this? Like this is an affront to like our dignity as well. And that's why like the civil rights movement is like, no, like we're going to make the case like we are going to be the people who will not accept the system, and like that's going to force you as in white people to be like, why am I participating in this too? And I think that's also like the particular quality of the individual, which is why it matters, because it's like America is that country which says like the individual matters above almost all else. And like King is also then saying like we have to move beyond that to like a sense of community, but also recognizing that like the individual or like the individual will does matter in that sense, because America itself is founded almost on that premise. But then, but yeah, I wanted to connect it also with Avant Garde, because I feel like something that I feel like has been happening with this second issue of the journal, which we launched in November around the Winston event that we did, was I really feel like each person who's been contributing to the journal in various ways, that everyone is almost like entering into some kind of battle with themselves. And it doesn't manifest all in the same way. But I feel like obviously like there are essays in, for instance, in the journal, like let's say like Samir's essay, where he is like in a much more like direct way, kind of almost like battling with himself and like what shaped him and what he had to go through as a person to reach where he is, and why he's reflecting on that in the midst of like what's happening with Palestine. But then even also like the essay that Samir or that Shambarto and Korba wrote around science, like that's also them battling with like their responsibility as scientists, or to like be like, why is it that the scientist who should be the most interested in basically like uncovering not just truth but also possible human possibility, why is it that like basically whole class or whole generation of scientists, of which I'm a part, like are so disinterested in humanity and so disinterested in like what's actually going on in American society, and in many ways are the most unscientific when you're actually faced with the real contradictions and paradoxes of America. And so I just want to say that, because I feel like it's like that, like each person I think has had to enter into that kind of battle. And it's not just a battle for yourself, but it's because we feel like almost instinctively, but also in a principled way, that to enter into that battle is to also enter into like battle with all of those forces which are impacting everyone in American society. And I feel like the kind of the impetus for why we're doing this event and why we're also dedicating the second issue to King, also like at the beginning of the Year of Baldwin, is to say that like I think there is a real sense of optimism where we see like a possibility that's unfolding right now, but like it's like the question like can the American people recognize that possibility, which is like especially with the Gaza stuff, but I think in many different kind of facets of American life, it's like people are already almost instinctively turning to King. It's just like it's not something that's fully, like as we would say, it's not something that's fully crystallized yet, but they're already doing it, and they're trying to like almost like grope their way back towards the memory of the Third American Revolution as the Free Schools kind of formulated it. And I think that part of what we're trying to do with the journal is to be like a witness for that, You know, we want to be a witness for everything that is possible in this moment, and to do justice to that, and to try to like awaken that sense of possibility, which it's like so demeaned and so disgraced and so like abused, I think, in American life. And yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to say that because I feel like it's also building on what everyone else is saying. But you know, it's like simultaneously, it's like to do justice to this moment, to be a witness for this moment, is to do justice to and to be a witness for King and for Baldwin and for the revolution that they were a part of. Because it's like it's only this moment which is basically forcing us to turn back to King, and not just us, but also basically the American people. And like that's also like what I feel like we're engaged with. And like I'm also really excited about being able to share this issue with people, because I think we're also trying to work out like what is our criteria for publishing, like what is our criteria for writing. And I think it always has to start with like the individual and like questions that each person is dealing with and having to think through and like wants to work out. But ultimately, like we give this because we think that this is something that is worthy of the people. And like they're like, you know, worthy of the people, worthy of King, which is the same thing. And I think that like that's why it's also in some ways kind of a almost like kind of like a terrifying ordeal. So like, you know, the way the King says it, like sometimes it does feel like almost like a vocation of agony, because like, yeah, like I had to write like an essay on, or like I felt like I had to write an essay on like actually defining what we mean by the Third American Revolution, because like I feel like I've been like thinking about it for basically the past 2 years, and it's like, yeah, it's like, you know, like that also that King thing where it's like, and yeah, Samir brings it up in his essay, like the question of the Good Samaritan, where it's like, if I don't do something, it's not, you have to flip the question of like, what will happen to me if I say something or if I speak out, and you have to flip it and be like, what will happen to me, but also what will happen to humanity if I do nothing, if I say nothing, if I remain silent. And I think that's like part of the, yeah, like I don't know, just like this question of like the battle that I feel like each of us has all had to go through, and to also work together with each other to arrive at that place. I think it's been a lot, honestly, but I think I'm very glad that we're doing this in concert also with the event that we're holding this.
Can I add? I want to add to what Jeremiah was saying, because one of the things that, like, you know, in the process of trying to write the science article or whatever, I don't know if it ended up being a science article, but it also made us realize, and also through things that we've read together from Baldwin and King, the fact that they're not taken seriously as thinkers. You know, I mean, King, yeah, I mean, I think it is common for people to pay lip service to somebody like King, but it's always from a position of, oh, this is a figure in the past who has to be put on a pedestal and then forgotten about, because all he would speak about was morality or goodness, or, you know, things that, for instance, scientists think they're above. Like, this is not rational or scientific enough, so why should we? And this is, I mean, I always remember what Noam Chomsky says about, like, you know, how he can't listen to King's speeches, because it's like, it's all about emotion, and it's all about the evocation to be moral or whatever, which is not really in the realm of science, and it's not really in the realm of rational thinking. But one thing that, well, this is not going to be this is not well formulated, because we're still trying to work it out, is, you know, I don't think I've struggled with the concept of modernity. And I think there is a way to think about modernity in terms of technological advance, or, you know, or, you know, means of production, of however you want to put it, but also like rational scientific thought, you know, starting with the Enlightenment. But then after a certain point in time, prematurely, well, first I should say what I actually think it means. Like, you know, when you really break it down to its essence, I think the most satisfactory meaning of it to me is the individual's path to like self-determination or self-actuation, not prescribed by the society, or, you know, the I don't know how to put it well, but I hope you still understand what I'm saying. So not prescribed by what has been, almost like a search for meaning that makes you into that complete human being that you're striving to be. And I think of Paul Robeson so much. And when we said Paul Robeson was a complete man, this is the, even if I don't have the words to like define modernity, that's what comes to my mind, that this search for self-actuation in some ways, to become whole, to become complete. And I feel like that was prematurely cut short with the imposition of something like postmodernism on the whole world. You're saying that, oh, we are over that. That period has passed. Man has found modernity, and now we're all about the postmodern, where the main goal is going to be to obscure all truth, to obscure all search for the truth, for self actuation. And the reason I say this is I have a very strong feeling, and this is only like in its baby stages in the way we have tried to put it in the essay, is that we have to think of King and Baldwin as philosophers and thinkers of modernity, which is a project that was abandoned before it could have been completed. And without it, I don't think it's going to be like, even this question, what you were talking about, the American private life, the question of the individual, it falls within that realm. And by ignoring King, by ignoring Baldwin as thinkers, as philosophers, in the scientific sense, you really curtail your own possibility of ever being able to answer that question. So, I don't know if I did a good job explaining, but I think we really, like, in the future, it would be good to work some of these things out, because on one hand, I've always been intimidated by this language, like modernity, all these categories and the language in which this is talked about. But there's also something I know in my heart, which I have to find the language to say, but they're not mutually exclusive. And King and Baldwin fall squarely within the realm of working these ideas out. And they have not been taken seriously as philosophers and thinkers.
Well, this is connected, but since we're talking about avant-garde, I also just wanted to say that, like, we have been working on putting it together, especially in the last few weeks, and we have sent the final file to the printer, and so we will have it at the Thursday event and the Saturday event. And we made an order of 100 copies, so it should last us through the year. And I think I just wanted to add that I'm really looking forward to how we all make sense of the second issue together, and all of the contributions in it, because something that some of us had also been reflecting on is even how much the second issue has transformed from the first issue. And I think I wanted to say this because I think the third issue will handle more explicitly what you're saying. Because when I'm thinking about the second issue of Avant Garde, it made me think about King's essay, which you brought up, like My Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. Because I feel that for example, Jeremiah's essay and Megna's essay and the Leo interview and Samir's essay and Purban Chambarto's essay, like everything is really saying the same thing, which is the European tradition has expired. And like the European categories, the West, some foundational framework from the Western world has expired, and we have no choice, if there is to be a future, to advance towards something new. Yeah. And I think what's so masterful is that everyone's contribution was essentially saying this thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's it. But I'm looking forward to all of us like getting to share like this experience together, basically.
Yeah, to what you were saying, Porva, this thing about like modernity or that type of language, I feel like it's actually to the extent that human beings can see themselves like as a whole, because I feel like that's what King was getting at when he was talking about a single garment of destiny or a beloved community, and when Diane Nash was talking about nonviolence being a new science to take people to like a higher level. You know, I feel like it's going from that maybe enlightenment and maybe science that was able to be all right with colonialism and imperialism, you know, to elevate the individual to an extent, but to also separate the individual. And these things that Baldwin and King get at with the private life, I feel like is this idea that when you remove these crutches that separate yourself from other people, it actually allows you to become an individual. It allows you to become a responsible, moral human being. So I feel like this interesting thing about the next stage of like human beings or to even peace or anything is to that extent that like you could see the other man or you could see that, because that's also the question I feel like about like maybe even the sixth what do you call it, the April 6th panel is like, to what extent do you want to see like you know, these things that you're looking for, like people do want peace, right? People do want to be in communion with the rest of the world. Like people want love, right? But there's this thing of like, like what there is kind of that individual notion that you do have to give up, right? To be able to get to these things. Just that concept that your life is like a higher, you belong to something greater, right? You belong to time because you have this history, right? But you also belong to like, you know, humanity, you know?
Can I just say something? And I think it would help us. I think indeed the European Enlightenment did establish the category of the individual. And then of course the rational individual and the self-interested individual. In other words, coming with the individual is the idea that your interest supersedes and precedes that of humanity and that of society. However, what was sacrificed is the category of the human. And that is precisely where Baldwin and King cut through. And well, that's just what I wanted to say. But I think we are recovering the concept of the human being. And
Wait, can I quote something? Can I quote something? In the essay, Every Goodbye Ain't Gone. Shit, man. Yeah, I don't know. But, fuck, I lost it. Wait, okay, never mind. The thing about it is that, okay, this phrase also is like, it's something that like happens, it's like a song, it just is in your head. So that's so funny that this essay came up just now, because when we were talking, I was thinking about my painting. And part of the painting or the structure of the painting was the wheel in the wheel concept. And I looked it up, and the wheel within the wheel was only one. Baldwin only used this one time in this essay, Every Goodbye Ain't Gone. Okay, so this essay, he says, I'm just gonna read it. So, circumstances, a rather heavy word when you consider it connecting for me by means of Ezekiel's wheel in the middle of a wheel with the iron, inescapable truth of revolutions. We Black folks say what goes around comes around. Circumstances, furthermore, are complicated, simplified, and ultimately defined by the person's reaction to these circumstances. For no one, no matter how it may seem, simply endures his circumstances. If we are what our circumstances make us, we are also what we make of our circumstances. This is perhaps the key to history. Since we are history, well, I'll say it again. This is perhaps the key to history. Since we are history, and since the tension of which I'm speaking is so silent and so private, with effects so unforeseeable and so public. I just wanted to read that. It says that he's writing this note just 29 years after my first departure from America. And then he goes into like what he saw his family and things like that. But there's this thing about like the public, private, and our relationship to history.
Just see what the chat is saying.
Okay, there have been some comments. So Todd, Christopher Romero, Stephen Palmier, Sparks, Ram Mohan Rai says good morning to all comrades. Fireplace says good morning, beautiful people. Amiri says good morning, I love you and hope you're taking care of yourselves amidst the agony of writing or speaking. However, I can support from far, I'm here, and we always will be. Rowan Frazier says morning, happy reading, listening, and discussing. Noah A says, hey, I made it again. You all are helping a father of 5 from Guam figure out how to best face the empire, so thank you all so much. We're nothing without our people, so we owe it all to our people. Such a great question. How do you live your life? If one isn't able to view our conditions critically, how corrupts us as such, who among us would say yes, this is how we should live our lives? And then in response to the Baldwin excerpt about like how you actually speak to your kids, he says, I can confirm that we're still at a similar or the same point because I have a hard time figuring out what to tell my kids. Amiri says, no kids, but I understand, Noah. The artist's struggle for integrity is the struggle for a moral private life, for painful truths to be shared with children in a loving way so they won't be unlettered. And then they were talking back and forth. Noah says, I end up just telling them straight, as censored as needed for them. Just based off of conversations with those I know, it seems like most people lack enough faith or belief without understanding of their collective power and ability. Amiri says, I feel you. Our responsibility is to restore their faith and belief in the possibilities through an understanding of our capacity, which will only grow. And then Noah says, indeed, and OOG, these conversations help in that growth. And I think this is maybe the most recent quote, but he says, oh, my heart. So it's just a nice conversation going on.
Also, with what was their famous thinking, I think part of it was like,
No, I just started reading the other parts of this essay, which honestly doesn't, well, but it's just 2 things. Then he says, every goodbye ain't gone. Human history reverberates with violent upheaval, unrooting, arrival, and departure. Hello and goodbye. Yet I am not certain that anyone ever leaves home. When home drops below the horizon, it rises in one's breast, and it acquires the overwhelming power of menace love. Of menace, like menace, MENANASC. I can't talk. Okay. Okay.
Could you just read that sentence?
Okay. So he says. Okay, wait. I'll say this. They cannot possibly know what they, ex-slave and ex-master, cannot be used as their fathers were used. That all identities, in short, are in question and are about to be made new. Every goodbye ain't gone. Human history reverberates with violent upheaval, uprooting, arrival, and departure. Hello and goodbye. Yet, I'm not certain that anyone ever leaves home. When home drops below the horizon, it rises in one's breast and acquires the overwhelming power of menaced love. And then he finished the essay with, I'll read the last paragraph, even though he talks about the European panic, which is probably important, I'm sorry. So he says, neither do I want anyone to suppose that I think that the gem of the ocean has kept any of its promises. But my ancestors counseled me to keep the faith. And I promised, I vowed that I would. If I'm a part of the American house, and I am, it is because my ancestors paid, striving to make it my home. So unimaginable a price. And I have seen some of the effects of that passion everywhere I have been, all over this world. That music is everywhere, resounds, and tells me that now is the moment for me to return to the eye of the hurricane.
Right, to return. Yeah. Just on the event, thank you for reading that. I think if we care about those that we say we care about, we will do all that we can to get them to these events. That's, I agree with what everyone has said. If this country doesn't need this now, what does it need? This is, the song, there's a balm in Gilead. The balm is the healing balm. That's an old Black spiritual. It used to be sung in every church regularly. I know in college, in our college choir, we sang it. Just if you want to hear a really good version of it, go on Spotify, the Tuskegee University Choir, when they sing There's a Balm in Gilead. And just if I could just say this, there's a famous tenor solo in it. I think you'll find it very compelling. But if there's anybody that we love or care about, we should do all we can to get them here. Because this is the balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. That's the way it goes. And I agree that healing the soul is part of healing the nation. We can't go forward. No other country has had this on its shoulder. And here I agree completely with Baldwin and completely with King. No other nation, no other civilization has so had to bear this responsibility. No other generation of young people has had this put before them. And no other generation of young people, I know certainly not my generation, has had so much thrown at them and so many obstacles towards clarity put upon them when one thinks about the whole university system. And I listen in horror with what students have had to go through at elite universities, and how, I get this from Nuri and Jeremiah, how the rebellion that they had to mount had to be so strong, and so much so that their professors felt betrayed by them, when in fact the shoe should have been put on the other foot. But we're just the free school has benefited from the fact that they did rebel and did go through it. At some sacrifice, I should say, especially in the case of Jeremiah. But I think it turned out for the better that you didn't go to graduate school. But I think, just the last thing, I think we are saying, as we always do, that there is a way out, that there is a sky, that even if we wanted to give up, it would be the most immoral thing to do, because there are generations that we are fighting for, not just for ourselves, but we're fighting We're fighting for the immortal child, that the children of Gaza are not, their lives and their deaths are not in vain. We have to say it over and over and over again. We have to remind the church of what immortality is, what, as Sarah said, that we live in both spheres of time, the colony of time and the empire of eternity. We're always living in both, and we're trying to, like King uses the word, a mastery of this. I don't know, where does he use that? He said it is a mastery of this. Somehow I forget right. But to master the way you navigate two spheres of time and two spheres of our beings, because we are both of the now, but we can aspire to something beyond the now, and to fight knowing, as, and this is the great beauty of Coretta Scott King's brief statement when President Ronald Reagan established that there would be a national holiday in the name of Martin Luther King. And she says, we must, first of all, she asked, what manner of man is this? This is a huge statement. And that's a big question of what manner of man was this? The other thing is, she said that we must make ourselves worthy of him, of that life. And that life was of that magnitude. And you know, I know there's always the tension between the European radical revolutionary tradition and the African American tradition, which is fundamentally the American tradition, has become, if there is to be an American identity, it is not to be found in whiteness, but in what King and Baldwin were talking about. This is we are so enriched by this legacy. It has, but that's I'll shut my mouth. It is the balm in Gilead. When King talks about love as the sword that heals, so many formulations that are so valuable for us right now.
Well, yeah, because I wanted to say that like part of what Serafina talked about was the painting or the mural that you did for the second issue was the research you were doing of like every day looking at like images and videos of the kids in Gaza in particular, and like not just like the pain, but also like like what they talk about and like how they're dealing with it. And I think and I feel like I just agree that a lot of what we're doing is also like are there deaths in vain? But like that's also a choice that people make, and I just feel like also this question of eternity is also really interesting because I feel like for people who do grow up in like I guess a more Christian context, I don't know about other ones, like I don't know, if you're exposed to like especially like different strains of like evangelicalism, like it's kind of hard to capture, and I don't know if you felt this way, but like how much the concept of hell looms over you as like especially as a young kid. Like I was like really worried about hell like all the time. And but like that's also your concept of like what eternity is in a lot of ways. It's like basically like eternal damnation. And I don't know if you felt I don't know, that was probably something because I was
had a social gospel.
Yeah. So different kinds of Christianity too. But I just feel like because it also goes back to the conversation about sin. And I feel like a lot of people will say like slavery and all this stuff was like America's original sin. And like in a certain way it was, but it's like it depends on how you view sin, where it's like part of the problem that Baldwin gets at is like, because Americans are so trapped by this like kind of like this very particular version of like Christianity, and like it's not just people who are like overtly religious, but even just like the ethic of it. It's like they're trapped in kind of that kind of like, oh yeah, this is our original sin, and there it's like this perpetual like guiltiness, this perpetual feeling of guiltiness, which is not just about Black people, but it's essentially about like the lives that people lead, and I think that like part of what like also like the Du Bois, the concept of the immortal child, which is that it's not just about your children, but like, can you live your life basically for like the endless potential of humankind, which is possible, the endless possibility of not just like your own like actual like family's children, but like the children of their children, and that endless possibility. And I feel like, and I think like I never processed this in the moment, but I think in retrospect, part of what I think was so like healing for me too as a person was like it gave me a different concept of like almost the eternal. Whereas I feel like I'd grown up with such an intense feeling of like just like worry or like guilt of like oh like shit, like I'm gonna go to hell or stuff. And then like that was partially the reason why I left the church, maybe similar to like James Reed, where it's like it didn't make sense to me that like for some arbitrary reason, like billions of human beings would like end up in hell for like something that like didn't make sense to me at all. And so that was part of the reason why I left the church. But I feel like like part of the like the healing nature of it, but also the like kind of the moral imperative that we all feel is this thing of like, oh yeah, like I owe something to like the future, and I owe something to like these generations unborn. And I think it's funny because like Eddie brought up this event that we did at Cornell, like while we were still working this stuff out, which is titled "Our Inescapable Responsibility," which I think we got either from Du Bois or I forget. Yeah, it's probably Baldwin. But I remember actually that day, this is like also getting like kind of personal, but like that one of the days of that event was the anniversary of my brother's passing. And like I remember like I was basically having like a breakdown that day because I was like, fuck, like I don't know if I can do it. But then I was like, no, like I have to do it because like like I don't know, it's really interesting. I was like, oh yeah, like I owe him something, and I also owe like Baldwin and King something, and like that was like literally the only way I could like make it through that day was almost because we were doing that event. I was like, yeah, like I owe something. I have a responsibility both to myself, to like my brother, but also to like these figures who I was not supposed to encounter, basically. And like the sad thing is that like Doc was saying, like whether it's like professors that we had or other people you encounter, it's like it is true that when you have a sense of like optimism or basic like sense of like faith and a sense of responsibility towards the future, people feel threatened by it, and they want to basically tear you down because your optimism or your sense of the future threatens their sense of identity, which is basically founded in kind of either nihilism or just cynicism. Whether they'll admit it or not. And sometimes they do admit it, and I think that's actually like I prefer that if they're at least honest about it. But like people like that is part of like the headwinds that we face, which is it's like our basic sense of optimism about the future, or that like the insistence that America does have a future after everything that it's gone through and that it is doing around the world. To insist that this country has a future, I think people are offended by it and they're threatened by it because their whole worldview is premised on this thing of like there is no future, and like it's almost like you develop this like kind of like narcissism around that pessimistic outlook. And like that's also like when I was talking about like bringing things to the surface, like we're also confronting that, like those contending like worldviews, contending forces within people of like like a lot of young people are not sure whether they feel there's a future for themselves personally, but also a future for the society. And like we have to bring that to the surface of like like let's like actually try to work it out. Like, is there a future? Like, is there a sky? So yeah.
Yeah, the event is for the immortal children of Gaza, but I also think it's both for the moral child and the children of America.
Yeah.
Because I think Eddie said this last week, which is what our government is willing to do to the children of Gaza, it's also doing here in America to our children, especially Black young children. And it has made an indelible mark on me to be working with Brandon at the high school. So this week is spring break, so we didn't meet at the high school. And I feel already like this gap in my heart where I'm like, oh, how's this kid that I saw doing like this week? And I don't know if they will be able to attend just in terms of logistics, but Brandon and I are going to try our best to bring them to the event both Thursday and Saturday. And it is that I feel like even in the past 3 weeks in which we've spoken to these students and specifically these 3 young Black men, you can see that something's turning on, like something like not immediate, where even before the first session, one of the students was like, oh, I want to leave Philadelphia. But then during one of our sessions, we were talking about the history of Philadelphia and Black Philadelphia. And you can see, like, for the first time he was hearing that actually Philadelphia, where he is from, is actually so beautiful and has this rich legacy. And also, like, I talked about the story too, which is like one of the kids saying, like, I wish someone older told me I love you. And I think that's what we're trying to say through reading Baldwin, which is that someone did love you through Baldwin and through King. And actually, there are people that love you today. And I'm specifically saying, like, the people in this room, because the reason why I want to bring them there is both to introduce them to King and Baldwin that said, I love you, and there's this world that you're a part of. But also, I want them to meet the whole of free school. Because I think in what Brandon has described, like, these young kids, they have constantly been told, like, that they're worthless or that there is no future for them. But I hope that they're able to come here and not just have interacted with Brandon and myself, but also meet everyone in this room too. Because I know, at least like when I first came to free school too, this was when we worked back at the Church of the Advocate. Like, I didn't understand what was going on, but something felt different. Like, that something felt different about the quality of people and even the space too. I'd never been in a Black church before. And yeah, I think I hope that, I mean, it's like, how many days? It's like 5 days away. And we got some outreach to do, like individual, family, friends, acquaintances, organizations. But I think that's the North Star.
When I went to the October gallery and we met Mercer for the first time, he had some of us cornered in a room and he said, listen, the problem with your generation is when we grew up, I was listening. The problem with your generation is when we grew up, we were tasked with rebuilding society after World War II. And I don't remember what he said after that, but from what I took from that was our generation, I think someone said this earlier, our generation has been granted the luxury, I guess, Eddie, you were sort of speaking to this, that we have the luxury to think about these internal ideas, whereas when you are, especially the men who were produced by the post-World War II generation, they never talked about the internal, and they were all about what is my duty to society, what is my duty to the flag, what is my duty to the church, what is my duty to the family. And our generation has been granted this luxury where we can decide, what is my duties to the future? Or if you think about your parents, they never thought, what does it mean for me to be an American? They're just trying to get here and make money and, produce a better life for their family. And there's nothing wrong with that, as we've said. But now we're here, and this task that has been left unfinished is, what does it mean for you and I to be Americans? And it's a more complicated question than when our parents got here. And so Yeah, and then listening to Alice, I was thinking, oh, what's the task for the next generation after? And the only thing that I can think of is, well, I guess that's why we're having this event on King, because that gives them the framework. So even if we're not here, they'll still have a framework to find out, what is my task? What if we fail and we don't find out what it means to build a new nation? Or what if we fail and we undo the work of our ancestors, the people who came before us, and we divide the country even further because we're really close to a civil war? I mean, I've never, I forget who said this, but if you go to other countries, it's not like this. Like it's not so divisive. Like even when I went to England, and right after they had released the restrictions, there's sort of like tension between people who wear masks and don't wear masks wasn't as present as it is in America. Well, I would never know if I never left America. But it just asks this question, how do we continue building on this foundation?
So I just want to say, I disagree with,
Mercer.
Mercer, yeah.
Oh, tell me, I'm still listening. I'm
yeah,
still listening.
yeah. No, of course, every generation has unique tasks, but it was not just, I mean, for the Black masses of people, the idea of rebuilding America or turning America into the great superpower, that was not our way of looking at the world. That was the way that the white world was told that their task was. And in a lot of ways, that's why they saw the Black freedom movement as interrupting and getting in the way of, quote, making America great, and they saw King as a, that's what they meant, that he was a communist, that he was getting in the way, that he was disrupting the American imperialism, so he had to be a communist. But Baldwin and King are of the generation right before us, and you see how they were talking, and of course Howard Thurman and so many other great thinkers, and I guess Diane Nash was closer to me. But yeah, I would disagree with him there. I think, in a lot of ways, I think the tasks before y'all are more complicated, very much ideologically more complicated than what I remember us experiencing. And I think, by the way, I think that the ruling class has more control over institutions and so on of society, and they're particularly at war, especially now with the student movement around Gaza, at war with the young generation. This war against Black young people goes back at least 30, 40 years, which is, as Alice describes it, with all of the claims of what hip hop culture, commercial pop culture has produced in terms of billionaires and rich Black entertainers and so on. Why do these young men still feel empty and threatened and don't know if they will have a life, I mean, physically a life, if all of this were the case? And it's been a war against them, the imprisonment of at least one third to 1/4 of at least 2 generations of young Black men, the prison industrial complex, and then the the police war on the community. So I think I think it's a far more difficult problem for you all. It was, for us, the moment was a revolutionary moment all around the world, India, China, Africa, and all of this going on. So that when a lot of times I could say when we thought about our task, we would look at the world and say, look what they are doing. Now, there was some weaknesses to that because we underestimated what this leadership of King and Baldwin were doing. And we tried to imitate too much the world movement, or the world movement. This is not China, this is not India, yada, yada, yada. But I think it's far more difficult for you all. You all have come of age, and at least 2 generations, if not 3, have been witness to one of the great counter-revolutions of all time. So, yeah, I give you guys a lot of credit. I mean, I'm in admiration of you, to tell you the truth.
I appreciate raising the question of institutions. Role that institutions play in helping you go beyond yourself. Sort of writing down a lot of the notes that people have brought up during today's conversation around sacrifice, cost, the deal that people have to make, the paying of dues. And when I think about all those things, I don't think that I'm hearing the group asking people to be martyrs. I think I hear that that sacrifice should be taken on because there's something on the other side, right? And that other side is a beloved community. We have to be able to signal to people the love, the joy, the higher aspirations of Maslow that can be reached once you get to that other side. But the path to get there can be very difficult if you don't have a structure to tap into. You don't have a church that can help you find beloved community. You don't have a school that can help you find beloved community. You don't have community networks that can do that. And I think that's what makes this space powerful, and particularly powerful if it can translate the type of on ramps that can get people engaged enough to find courage. And that's a long game because the things that people experience in the world every day don't lead them to want to make courageous decisions. And being connected to institutions, connected to legacy, is what helps you put to the side some of your short-term interests for long-term aspirations. So,
Well, this conversation actually reminded me of one of Baldwin's essays called "The American Dream and the American Negro," and that essay is sort of a transcript of a speech that he gave in 1965 when he was debating this person called William Buckley. And the motion of that debate was, has the American dream been achieved at the cost of the American Negro? Right? And in Baldwin's speech, he goes into, just beautifully talking about all, like, the history of America, systemic racism, the purpose of dehumanizing an entire portion of America for certain motives. And he ends that speech with a call to consciousness that you have to people today has to raise their consciousness in order to understand this history and move forward with this history. But the reason why our conversation reminded me of it is because at the very end, I think he makes the assertion. So this is the motion, right? Has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro? And he was supposed to be speaking for the motion, and William Buckley was supposed to be speaking against the motion. And what he actually does is say that I actually don't even believe that the American dream has been achieved. It's not a question of whether it has been achieved at the cost of the American Negro or not. It has not been achieved, and it will not be achieved till we
Right.
can come together as a nation which actually sees everybody as the same and can, in light of what he said, achieve that higher state of consciousness. And then we'll be on the path to achieving the American dream. We haven't achieved it. Nobody's achieved it. The white people in this country who think they've achieved it are living in an illusion almost. They are denying themselves reality. Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll end this free school. And to all of our listeners online, thanks for tuning in. And we'll see you on the live stream for Thursday and Saturday, which we figured out how to live stream it. So. We did it for you. But okay, bye everyone, and share our flyer online.